her speakers. Let me just try rebooting. Good evening. If you are joining the meeting, we are starting a little late due to technical difficulties. If you can just hold on, we will call to order as soon as possible. Thank you for your patience. Good evening. If you are just joining us. Good evening. If you are just joining us, we are having a little bit of a delay due to technical difficulties. If you can hold on a moment, the meeting has not started. Thank you for your patience.
Welcome to the special meeting of the Planning Commission this Thursday evening, January the 12th. The special meeting tonight was continued from January 10th. From January 10th, 2023, which was adjourned due to power outage issues. This is a special meeting and the only item tonight is the city's housing element. Our meeting is being held at the San Mateo Main Library, Oak Room, instead of council chambers due to continued power outages issues at City Hall. We also have a Zoom option available. I now call this meeting to order. Please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Mary, can you please do the roll call?
Yes. Chair Williams is absent. Vice Chair Ebnetter.
Present.
Commissioner Nugent.
Present.
Commissioner Patel. Present. And Commissioner Wiggins is absent.
So as I mentioned earlier, this is a special meeting. There's a conference code 8399835 2815, passcode 780571. We're excited to have you here in person and all those who are viewing virtually. For those attending in person, complete a yellow request to speak slip and hand it to the clerk if you want to participate verbally in the meeting. If participating remotely, use the raise your hand feature in Zoom and you will be called on at the appropriate time. If calling via phone, press *9 to raise your hand, and when called upon, press *6 to unmute. These options for public comment will remain available until I close the public comment period for that specific item. I do not see any note for comments on items that are not on the agenda. Is that not part of the evening's program? Perfect, thank you. So we will call item number 1, the general plan amendment to adopt the City of San Mateo's housing element for 2023-2031. We will start with a staff presentation, followed by clarifying questions from the commission, and then move to public comments. Members of the public are given 3 minutes to speak, depending on the number of speakers. Once the public hearing is closed, the commission will deliberate and provide a recommendation to City Council. Can we please have the presentation?
Yes, thank you. Good evening, Chair and Commissioners. My name is Eloisa Murillo Garcia, and I am the Housing Manager. And I'm joined here by Zach Dahl, who's our Deputy CDD Director. And we have Diana Elrod, who's our Housing Consultant, available via Zoom, and she will also participate in the presentation. As you mentioned, we are here to discuss the draft 2023-2031 housing element. Oops. And first off, I just wanted to introduce the rest of the team. Not all of them are here with us today, but this has definitely been a group effort. So we wanted to acknowledge everybody who's been involved. So we have Zach, as I mentioned before. We have Manira Sandir, our planning manager, who is also available via Zoom. We'd also like to acknowledge Sandra Council, who's our prior housing manager, who really got this process started, as well as Julia Klein and Linda Lee from our planning division, and Nicholas Vu, who's our housing specialist. In addition, we've had some consultants that were part of this effort. As I mentioned before, Diana Elrod from Diana Elrod Consulting, Nicholas Hamilton from Good City Company, Root Policy, and 21 Elements. I'll give you a quick overview of tonight's agenda and presentation overview. First, we'll give a brief overview on the housing element background. And next, we'll get into some of the main housing element updates and revisions that have taken place since the initial draft was released. We'll discuss the sites inventory, as well as AFFH, the goals, policies, and programs, the public comments that we've received, as well as responses. After that, we'll have the opportunity for clarifying questions, public comments, and finally, Planning Commission discussion and recommendation. So this is just a brief background on the housing element. The housing element is a required element of the general plan, but unlike the other chapters, the housing element requires certification by the state, in this case, the California Department of Housing and Community Development, or HCD, and we'll refer to this department as HCD going forward. We are currently in the midst of our 6th housing element cycle, which is an 8-year cycle, which runs from 2023 to 2031. The regional housing needs allocation for the entire Bay Area is over 441,000 units. And for the city of San Mateo, it's just over 7,000 units. The city did submit their first draft to HCD on July 1st of 2022, and HCD had a 90-day review period. And after that review period was over, they provided a comment letter on September 28th of 2022. And this just gives you a further breakdown of the 7,015 units that are part of the RHNA allocation. And these are broken down by income categories. And just to give you just a timeline of where we're at, the initial public comment period ran from April 6th to May 30th, which was the required 30-day public comment period. As a result of comments and after holding hearings with Planning Commission and City Council, the housing element was updated, and that draft was submitted to HCD on July 1st. As I mentioned earlier, they then provided a review letter on September 28th. And since that time, staff has been working on addressing the comments from the HCD letter, and a revised draft housing element was prepared and made available for public review from December 30th through January 9th. Next, we have the Planning Commission and City Council meetings that are scheduled to take place this month. And finally, with the goal to submit the adopted housing element to HCD by January 31st of this year. I'll just give you a brief overview of the HCD first review letter. As I mentioned, that was received in September of 2022. The letter included 91 comments, and the comments also included consideration of comments that were received by HCD by organizations and individuals. Staff has prepared revisions to the housing element based on these comments, and there's an attachment to exhibit B of your packet. Has all the 91 comments on there. Each comment is numbered and categorized, and it includes the applicable housing element section, as well as the city's response. And the last column shows the location of the changes within the housing element. So that'll be easier for you to find where the changes were made. Some of the main comment areas that were in the letter included the affirmatively furthering fair housing, or AFFH, the sites inventory, the constraints analysis, and goals, policies, and programs. And this is just an overview of the key housing element revisions that were made to each of those four categories. So in the affirmatively furthering fair housing, or AFFH section, we included more information on the development and prioritization of contributing factors in the city. We provided more detail on fair housing legal cases and inquiries, expanded data on changes in racial composition in the city, included an enhanced discussion of special needs groups, and finally included a greater analysis of recaps and RCAAs, which are recaps are racially and ethnically concentrated areas of poverty, and RCAAs are racially concentrated areas of affluence. In addition, there were some significant changes made to the housing sites inventory as a result of the comment letter. We included greater detail on pipeline projects that are under review, approved, or being constructed. We developed a more detailed narrative by explaining each site individually and outlined the basis for the realistic capacity calculation. In addition, we added more information regarding affordable housing projects in the pipeline and proposed on city land through a public-private partnership effort. Also, for the housing sites inventory, we updated narrative and methodology. We updated the narrative and methodology section for development on non-vacant sites, added background information on the age, size of buildings demolished for recently entitled development. We provided more detailed description of existing uses and maximum redevelopment potential, and added a new policy for outreach to owners of properties that are on the site's inventory. For the constraints analysis, that section was updated to add more information on the city's land use controls and how they do or do not impact housing development. There was a further evaluation on open space requirements in the R3 zone and design review constraints, and policies H1.8 and H1.13 were amended. We added additional information about the general plan update and how Measure Y will be addressed as part of the GPU adoption process in 23-24. And finally, for the goals, policies, and programs section, we updated and clarified timelines for various programs. The implementation timelines were revised for various programs per HCD comments, and in many cases, the target dates for completing those programs were moved up to earlier in the cycle in accordance with HCD's comments. 2 new policies were added, one to goal H1, which is production, and one to goal H4, which is promotion. Many of the policies and program measures were revised to provide additional clarity and to address constraints. And I will now turn it over to Diana for the next part of the presentation.
Thank you and good evening. I'll try to be brief about this. We thought it would be helpful to revisit the site's inventory statutory requirements. What is the site's inventory and what is it not? And really the purpose of the inventory is to ensure there are enough sites zoned at appropriate densities to accommodate all the RHNA allocation, including by income category, plus some measure of a buffer. It is not a list of sites that of all sites that may be developed. Some identified sites will not be developed with housing, while some sites not identified in the inventory will be developed with housing. So this is a capacity exercise. The housing elements, policies, and programs focus on encouraging new housing production, increasing development feasibility, and expanding new housing opportunities to implement the site's inventory. Next slide, please. There we go. This is a bit of a refresher. Also, this is detailed extensively in the housing element. Sites were identified through a methodical review of individual parcels, primarily throughout the 10 GPU study areas. And the initial vetting of the site typologies were approved by HCD. Specifically, we talked to them about how to address things like Amali stones, how to address vacant, I'm sorry, not residential, vacant commercial or vacant office space, et cetera. The sites that we looked through, we ranked as to the likelihood of redevelopment, with one being the least likely. These are sites with substantial constraints or locations of chain retails, things like gas stations, with, I think, one exception. We have not included any gas stations or major grocery stores. And then to level 5, which was the highest, which included pipeline projects or those that had owner or developer interest. Other sites were included primarily in the 4 category, those with vacant uses, older developments with low FAR, et cetera. And we met with developers to discern what they look for in redeveloping sites. Next slide, please. In addition, we reviewed zone versus built density, determines assumptions about what we could achieve in the housing element sites inventory. We made continued revisions to the inventory, which meant that some units and sites were removed and others were added. The recent developments average well over 100% of zone density because of density bonus. And although we cannot assume every project will use a density bonus, we can use an average of zone versus built densities as the metric for our inventory. The relatively low density of 50 dwelling units per acre results in a high probability of projects using density bonus and maximizing available density. We used a conservative estimate of 100% of zone density for realistic capacity for the larger sites, and only 50% for smaller sites, assuming that they are a little harder to design a development on the smaller sites. And this approach, with evidence to support that our approach, was confirmed by HCD. Next slide, please. This map is a TCAC opportunity map, and it shows areas of highest resource, high resource, moderate, and moderate resource rapidly changing. And you can see the vast majority of sites are in the high resource area. And I want to make a comment about concerns about the highest resource areas. These are areas that are typically in San Mateo, are typically single family neighborhoods, can be, and the assumption is that quite a number of ADUs would be included in those areas. Next slide, please. On the next 2 slides, we talk a little bit more about, in detail, about multifamily residential realistic capacity. And I'm just going to summarize this and we can go into more detail about it. Basically, 11 of 14 infill projects exceeded 100% of zone density, 100% at 50 DU per acre. And the average was approximately 112% of zone density. There were some slight outliers, but those were quite rare, and only 3 of them, and those averaged 18.2 DU per acre. And these were either in a flood zone located far away from transit, or they were ownership projects. And the building type is typically something akin to townhomes instead of large multifamily high density housing. In addition, at the bottom here, we're assuming 100% of base zone density for multifamily infill sites, and that's either 50 or 35 DU per acre in accordance with the base density. For small sites less than ½ an acre, we assumed only 50% of base density, again, because the difficulty of developing on smaller sites, there's less room to move around and put massing in different locations. And for sites similar to the outlier projects, we assumed the density was at 18.2 DU per acre. Next slide. In terms of mixed use and commercial realistic capacity, of the approvals from 2017 to 2022, 20 of the 25 projects included residential uses. 9 projects had 100% residential and 11 were mixed use. 11 projects exceeded 100% of base density. The average density was a little bit lower at 98%, And the state guidance is to look at 80% of the trends, which would result in 39 DU per acre. So for mixed use sites, the potential density was really estimated at between 30 and 35 units per acre. And again, for small sites less than a half an acre, it was assumed that it would be developed at 50% of base density. Next slide, please. There was a lot of discussion in the HCD letter, and we provided a lot more detail about non-vacant sites. And the guidance from HCD articulates the factors to look for in determining development potential. And as we've heard over and over from HCD, the gold standard is owner or developer interests. Those are the ones that shoot up to the top of the list. However, also other things can be considered, like the age of development, local development trends, market considerations, land value information, known leases, degree of underutilization, et cetera, including, for example, low FAR, like a small building on a sea of parking. Next slide, please. To continue, any individual factor cannot be taken alone, but rather in the context of the market and development trends. For example, the presence or absence of long leases is not by itself determinative. I know of one particular project, a new project in an East Bay city in which an office development had new leases, fully long-term leases, and a developer bought it and bought out all the leases and is turning it into a large high-density residential project. Similarly, current owner disinterest does not necessarily prevent inclusion on the site's inventory. Instead, you have to consider all the factors together and ultimately come up to the extent to which residential is the highest and best use, plus experience with development on similar sites in the city and regionally. The state is looking for regional trends as well. Next slide, please. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Zach to talk about pipeline projects.
There we go. 640 new housing units under construction, almost 1,600 housing units approved, and another almost 700 units under review right now. This would either mean through the pre-app process or currently under review under the formal development review. Cumulatively, this constitutes over 2,900 units, which is 42% of the city's total RENA. So that gets us a really good start on moving forward and achieving the numbers outlined in our regional housing needs.
We seem to have lost Eloisa.
Sorry, 1 second. We lost our computer connection. Let me try to get the presentation back up. There we go. Is everyone able to see my screen now? There we go. All right. Looks like we're back up and running. Apologies for that. Let's go next slide. So another element of the housing element that we really wanted to highlight a lot stronger is the connection and relationship between our housing element and our general plan update process. This process originally started in 2018 and ideally would have been completed before our housing element was ready for adoption. But given a variety of circumstances, including the COVID pandemic, we're on track for adoption by the end of 2023. And so what we're doing with the general plan update is looking long-term at adding housing capacity to meet not only this REMA, but future REMAs as well. And so the current draft land use map that is associated, that's been adopted by the City Council, and we, as part of our draft general plan update that's published later this year, includes increases in densities that will allow for up to 21,900 new housing units over the next 20 years. And what's important to note is over 90% of the sites on our sites inventory are within one of the 10 study areas in our general plan. So most of those sites are looking at significant increase in allowable density once the general plan update is out. And this was done on purposely and was as we were developing. We moved closely at sites within our sites both for inclusion on this inventory and then ultimately as part of the general plan update, significant increase in allowable density. So with the adoption of the general plan update, that would be including a significant increase in the buffer for our site inventory for this house. Apologies for that. Now, speak a little slower. So, right here, you can see how our sites, our 10 study areas for the general plan update, align with the sites of our site inventory. And you can see there's a cluster kind of around 92 that are outside. For the most part, all of our sites are within the study area, which means all of them will be looking at some degree of a density increase with the adoption of our general plan update with the current changes. Also, as part of the general plan update, we are facilitating a discussion about Measure Y and a path forward to allow for this increased growth, while also balancing that with community concerns about the overall community and the level of growth that could entail. Ultimately, all elements of the general plan that exceed the limits of Measure Y will require an updated ballot initiative that is approved by the voters. Ultimately, if we move forward according to schedule, we could be on track to have a ballot initiative that updates or modifies Measure Y if that's ultimately the direction on the ballot in 2024. We've also included a new policy that specifically supports this general plan update effort and specifically highlights the discussion around Measure Y, which is identified as a constraint to housing. We also want to highlight the city's direct effort in funding and contributing property to support the production of new affordable housing. We have our project that's currently under construction, Kiku Crossing, which will be developing 225 new affordable units. We are also going through the development review process for 2 city-owned parking lots off of B Street and Railroad. And this is a public-private partnership with the adjacent property owners. And this would be a mixed-use project that includes 60 affordable units. In addition, we have our housing fund, which currently has almost $6 million in it. And we are continuing to build that fund with a target of hopefully achieving over $26 million in revenue generated over this upcoming housing cycle. And then this fund would be used to then leverage to ideally construct additional affordable units. And we also have another property, city-owned property, on El Camino Real more toward the south end of the city, which could potentially be utilized for affordable housing. And we've updated policy 1.2 to reflect this and be more specific about feedback. I did also want to highlight how the funding breaks down, because it's important to note, and we did note this within the housing element of the cost to produce affordable housing in particular. It's a significant price tag. And so this is how, for the Kiku Crossing project, city funding was then used to leverage other funding sources, including county funds and state funds, to ultimately fund and construct this project with mid-peninsula housing. And as you can see here, the city's contribution was $7.5 million plus an additional $5 million sponsor loan with MidPen. And then this also includes the acre of land. This isn't counting the public parking lot that supports this project, just the land under the building, which is valued at approximately $9.7 million. And ultimately, to build this project, was over $750,000 per unit to construct these units. Another area we wanted to highlight was supporting increased production of missing middle housing. We wanted to more specifically highlight this and highlight the various policies in a number of areas that ultimately will go to supporting production of this critical piece that kind of bridges the gap between affordable housing and market rate housing. And this includes a number of policies under Goal 1 that will ultimately help increase production of this important housing category. Also, we wanted to provide an update on our accessory dwelling units. We do have final numbers for 2022, and we did see a significant uptick in both application activity and permits issued. So the application submitted kind of is indicative that we should continue to have a strong year in 2023 for permits issued. Overall, we are looking at an average over 4 years of 60 permits per year issued. And so based on that number, we are estimating 55 ADUs annually. And that's the number that went into our site inventory. We also wanted to highlight that we're using very conservative assumptions when it comes to breaking down these units across affordability and market categories. A lot of jurisdictions are going with 30% for low, moderate, and very low, and then 10% above moderate. We went with a more conservative formula because we wanted to be sure that we have and we also have updated our programs that support ADU production. And that includes annual money. So if we see multiple years where our production is short of that 55, we will then take action to look at ways that we can beef up that production to ensure that over the 8-year period, we can achieve or exceed. At this point, to discuss our affirmatively furthering fair housing section, I'm going to turn it back over to Diana.
Thank you, Zach. Just as a background, AB 686 requires public agencies to provide an AFFH analysis beginning in January 1st, 2019. And there are 5 areas that have to be looked at: fair housing enforcement and capacity, segregation and integration, disparities in access to opportunity, disproportionate housing needs and displacement risks, and racially, ethnically concentrated areas of poverty and concentrations of affluence. The goal is really to administer programs and activities relating to housing and community development in a manner that affirmatively furthers fair housing and to take no action inconsistent with this obligation. Next slide. So the challenges that were identified through the extensive analysis provided by Root Policy in conjunction with city staff is that racial and ethnic minority populations are disproportionately impacted by poverty, overcrowding, cost burdens, and homelessness. Northeast areas of the city are the most impacted, and discrimination complaints are generally speaking based on disability and race. Disability primarily in the sense that people are asking for modifications to their homes to support themselves, and the not being able to get reasonable accommodations through their landlords. Next slide, please. The city's approach to address this, we've included a number of new programs to reduce barriers to housing in high opportunity areas, both within the general GPPs, the goals, policies, and programs, but also within the AFFH specific goals, promoting housing supply, conserving and improving assets in areas of poverty, and protecting residents from displacement. Next slide, please. So the revisions included more narrative on local trends and needs, as well as a prioritization of contributing factors. We basically had the Root Policy look at the inventory with the distribution of units by income spatially to determine whether or not where we had identified areas that or sites that could accommodate affordable housing, whether the proposed housing sites are not in areas with existing concentrations of lower income households. And in fact, the inventory is not expected to increase segregation. In fact, the opposite is has been one of the conclusions is that it will actually increase desegregation and further, the location of affordable units in the inventory will provide lower income households with access to transit and services. And that is amongst many other findings of the study. Next slide, please. The other required components of the housing element include existing and potential housing resources, climate change, context and energy conservation, a review of the prior element. Just for information, 2,573 units were completed through the 7th year of this past cycle. This is 81.3% of the city's 5th cycle RHNA allocation, which is 3,164 units. The city also adopted a commercial linkage fee and increased the inclusionary requirements to 15%. And there have been a number of process improvements and code amendments to help streamline and cut the cost of housing. With that, I believe I'm sending it back over to Zach.
Thank you, Diana. I'm going to be discussing the goals, policies, and programs within the housing element. There are 5 overarching goals within the housing element. The first one is production, and I'll get into a little bit more detail in the next slides, but the production goal includes 21 policies. Goal 2 is preservation, which includes 6 policies. Goal 3 is protection, which includes 7 policies. 4 is promotion with 5 policies, and goal 5 is affirmatively furthering fair housing, which includes 14 policies. So with goal 1, the production goal, this is to encourage the production of new housing at all income levels with a particular focus on affordable housing. Within this goal, there are programs and policies to utilize public funds and properties to build more affordable units, support ADU production, encourage housing development through zoning code amendments, and as well as new policies to coordinate with water and sewer providers to to address the constraints posed by Measure Y by supporting the general plan update process. The preservation goal is for the preservation of existing housing that is affordable to lower and middle income residents. And programs and policies include to prevent the conversion of existing affordable units from becoming market rate by renegotiating agreements, using public funds to acquire the units or require developers to replace any lost units. Indirectly preserve affordable housing by improving the quality of life of residents to prevent displacement, incentivize upgrades to low-income homes through rehabilitation, accessibility modifications, or energy efficiency changes, and enable capital improvements and resiliency projects that protect against threats posed by climate change. For goal 3 is protection, and that's the protection of current residents to prevent displacement. And programs and policies include to prevent gentrification and displacement through protection of lower income residents, address homelessness and increase shelter capacity, affirmatively fund and support outreach services for at-risk renters or those facing fair housing challenges, prioritize special needs tenants and below market rate units, explore a rental registry to track rents and monitor trends and evictions, and undertake several other actions to affirmatively further fair housing. Can you go to that? The fourth goal is the promotion of community engagement and public outreach. And this includes programs and policies to increase awareness and to increase access and awareness of housing programs through the use of new technology as part of a robust and proactive public outreach strategy, as well as to provide education and information on regulatory requirements and specific programs and protections offered locally, regionally, and by the state. And this is to improve access to housing for all income groups and special needs communities, as well as to support community-wide rental wait lists and centralize the occupancy of BMR units. In addition, conduct public outreach in a diversity of methods and forms to reach all residents and program beneficiaries to ensure those in need can find supportive programs and service providers. And finally, a new policy was added under this goal to conduct direct outreach to owners and developers of properties that are located on the site's inventory. The final goal is to affirmatively further fair housing. And this includes an AFFH fair housing action that cross-references items that are interwoven within the housing plan's other 4 goals, policies, and programs. So within the housing element, you will see within the GPP section, sometimes you will see a reference to one of the other goals H1 through H4. And those are also referenced in AFFH. This also includes actions to address issues focused on groups that have disparate housing needs in the city, concentrated in census tracts that have high rates of poverty. For example, the Hispanic community and single female heads of household. And finally, for persons with disabilities, who also experience housing discrimination due to low economic opportunity and failure of landlords to provide reasonable accommodations. And I will now turn it over to Zach, who will discuss the public comments that were received.
Perfect. Thank you, Eloisa. And hopefully everyone can hear. Apologies if we're having any audio issues, as we are working to make sure everyone can hear what we're talking about here. We did want to take a few minutes to touch on the public comments received. Obviously, we've had a very robust outreach effort that's gone on for the past 2 years. These we're focusing on the public comments received since the updated draft housing element was published on December 30th. So as of, I think, about 3 p.m. this afternoon, we had received 12 written comments. And of those comments, 2 were from groups and organizations, and the other 10 were from individuals. And there was a variety of topics covered. Those included concerns about the feasibility of various properties on the site's inventory, also concerns about too much housing being allowed or promoted. And then also concerns about the spread and location of where this new housing was going. This kind of was focused on the idea that we're trying to put too much in concentrated areas, and potentially it should be spread in other areas of the city. And so though there obviously was a lot more, but those were just some of the higher level or repeat themes that we've seen in this most recent batch of comments. Also, we did want to spend a little time, since there was some concerns raised by the Housing Action Coalition about a number of sites on our site's inventory. And so we wanted to spend a little time talking about that. And then we're also going to highlight how we plan to update the housing element in response to these comments raised. The Bridgepoint Shopping Center site, that has been an area of focus and comments over the entire housing element period. And I think here there was concern raised about the long-term leases. And what we want to highlight for this site is, given the amount of parking and the fact that we are looking for a significant increase in allowable density under the general plan update, We see this as an opportunity site, even with those uses being maintained, whether in their current locations or part of new mixed-use projects. And we do see that in recent projects around the city where just because we have a use, that use doesn't necessarily go away. It can either be part of the new project or the housing could be built on an area of the site beyond the footprint of the structure itself. This is also similar for the Hillsdale Mall sites. This one, we have very active owner interest. They've been doing outreach longer term and then again more recently. And we also have received a specific letter from them highlighting what they feel is feasible as part of a mixed use. And what we want to highlight is, given the density that's assumed for this site, which is 35 units an acre, there's been concerns raised that this includes the areas of the mall that were recently redeveloped or invested in. And for a density of 35 units an acre, you can fully achieve that density without fully utilizing the site. And so what we really want to highlight is you can use the full site to establish your density and maximize the number of units that can be built, but then those units can be clustered on the site. So you're not utilizing the full site to actually build them. And I think that's the real opportunity with the Hillsdale Mall sites. And then also with successful adoption of the general plan update, could be significant additional capacity unleashed on this site as well. Similar for the Atrium site, there were concerns raised that this was under the e-zoning and housing requires a special use permit. As we'll touch on in more detail on the next slides, we are looking at adding a program to amend the code to allow residential as a permitted use in the C and E zones for all sites that are not within the residential overlay. And then kind of these are similar themes also for Burrell Square. In this case, we do have a letter of owner interest. We do see it as an underutilized site, and there is partially vacant areas. So also these existing uses, some that are there maybe under long-term lease, that doesn't necessarily preclude using other areas of the site for the development of housing. Similar for the Elks and Shriner sites. These are older buildings and the sites are underutilized. And so development of housing on these sites doesn't necessarily mean their uses have to go away. They could coexist. And similar with Olympic Plaza and then other sites as well. So what we are looking to do is connect the dots on these themes where we don't necessarily see an existing use or even a long-term lease as something that would preclude that site if these other factors are present. And so as I touched on earlier, here are a couple of revisions we're proposing to the housing element in response to the public comments we've received. First to policy 1.2, which is to kind of clarify that we would be utilizing public funding and properties for new affordable housing, and then add additional programs that are more explicit. One, speaking to the bespoke project that's currently under the development review process. Also correctly highlighting the property along El Camino Real. There was some confusion with the site referred to as the Ravioli site, which is a city-owned parking lot adjacent to the Ravioli house on B Street. We don't necessarily see that site as feasible for housing during this cycle because there are constraints present there. For policy 1.7, we are looking at recommending a program to amend the zoning code for the C and E districts for non-overlay areas to allow residential as a permitted use. So this would get rid of the special use permit requirement if housing is desired on one of those sites. And that could be 100% housing project, not just mixed use. And then also, and I'll show you an example on the next slide, we are looking at adding a supplemental table for our sites inventory. And this one would focus just purely on the evidence and the pieces of information present that justify that site's inclusion on the site's inventory. And so this is really not adding new information so much as it's pulling information from various locations in the housing element and putting it into one spot to really clearly articulate the case. Because what we've seen with some comments is there was some confusion because certain areas may not have included all of the evidence to support a site, but that didn't mean that it isn't there or justified when looking at other elements of the housing element. And so this table, obviously this is a screenshot, this is still a work in progress, but we are looking at building a table that focuses on the specific reasons that justify a site, also highlighting if this site is identified for a land use increase with increased density as part of the general plan update. And so next steps. From here, after the Planning Commission has had a chance to discuss the draft housing element and provide a recommendation, we'll be moving forward to council for adoption. And we do include our CEQA exemption document that goes along with this, and this was included in your packet. And then with a target following adoption to submit the housing element to HCD by January 31st. January 31st is the stated deadline to submit a compliant housing element to the state. If we are unable to do so by January 31st, we are subject to loss of local control and what has often been termed the builder's remedy, which gives a property owner the ability, if they meet certain criteria, to submit a housing project by right, and they are not subject to local land use and zoning controls. There was, as we have discussed previously, under earlier cycles, there was a 120-day grace period where it did shorten the time for any required rezonings, but it did hold off on any loss of local control or penalties from the state. However, based on input from the state, that does not appear to be a grace period they're looking to allow for this housing site. And then in addition, with the loss of local control could also come the loss of access to certain state funds that come into the city to support housing and other initiatives. And so what's important to note is under statute, it's not HCD certification, but rather local adoption of a substantially compliant housing element. And so with the draft city council resolution that was included in your packet, we do include findings to support adoption. And we have two matrices in Exhibit A and Exhibit B that focus specifically on statutory compliance and how we've updated our housing element to respond to the comments provided by HCD. So with that, the recommendation that's before you this evening is to recommend adoption of the housing element subject to the findings and the environmental review finding exemption included in the draft city council resolution. And this recommendation would be communicated to the city council via the planning commission resolution, which is attachment 1 in your packet. So that does conclude staff presentation, and we are available if you have any questions.
Thank you, Zach, and the rest of the staff for the presentation. My fellow commissioners, would you rather have your clarifying questions now, or would you like to go to public comment first? Up to you.
To the chair, I would actually prefer to have public comment first, just to provide the public the ability to talk without having to wait.
Mm-hmm.
I was actually going to say the opposite, that we might ask some questions of staff that the public has. And so if we ask our questions first, if those questions get answered before public comment, then people can use their time to comment on other things.
Okay. In that case, Adam, unfortunately, I will agree with Seema at this time. And would you like to start, Seema, yourself with qualifying questions?
Sure. And I will apologize to staff in advance. I didn't send these beforehand. Many of them I thought of as you were going through the presentation. So I fully understand you might not have the answers to all of these at hand right now. Okay. So this idea of self-certification and adoption versus HCD certification, I have a few questions about that specifically. My first question is HCD certification required for eligibility for state funding, or is self-certification and local adoption sufficient for funding eligibility?
Our understanding is that we would align with statutory requirements, which would be local adoption. But if there's subsequent actions taken by the state, that could change.
Okay. And I have a similar question, which is specifically about the builder's remedy, which HCD recently clarified to a different city, I can't remember which one, that the 120-day grace period does not apply to the builder's remedy. And so my similar question is, HCD certification required for avoidance of the builder's remedy, or is self-certification and local adoption sufficient?
Based on our current interpretation of the statute, which is local adoption until the state finds otherwise. So if we have local adoption and then the state takes specific action to say that we are non-compliant, then we could potentially be subject to the builder's remedy until we address those state concerns.
Okay, great, because that was my following question, which was, what happens if we feel we are in substantial compliance, and so we locally adopt and self-certify, and then HCD comes back and says, we disagree, we do not find this housing element in substantial compliance. Are we then not in compliant? Can we disagree with HCD? How does that disagreement get resolved? Like, who has ultimate say if we think we are in compliance with those, there's a special name for it, ordinances? No, that's not it. The statutory requirements. Yeah, who has final say if we believe we are in compliance with the statutory requirements, but HCD believes that we are not? How is that adjudicated?
I can start with a response, and then maybe I'll go to our city attorney's office to weigh in on that. The key word, the substantial compliance, is the term used there. So there could be areas that need to be addressed with our housing element identified by the state that does not necessarily mean we're out of compliance. It just depends on how significant those issues are. They could come around and say, yeah, issues here at present do constitute in non-compliance, and then we would be obligated to update the housing element and or adopt updated findings that speak to the contrary. And that would require us to provide additional evidence if we were going to continue to make the case that we feel we are in substantial compliance. But beyond that, in terms of how ultimately the state, I believe, is the final say. So yeah, I think at the end of the day, the state gets to make the final call. So we would then be on the hook to respond to those comments and address.
Okay, so again, I fully understand you might not have the answers to these because we're getting a little bit in the weeds, but if we self-certify and adopt this housing element, I understand that funding, that grants for some of these sources of state funding, typically those deadlines start in March. And so if we apply for those grants and we have not yet heard back from HCD, what happens is, are we still able to apply? But ultimately, we need to hear back from HCD about whether or not we're in compliance until we can potentially receive some of that funding.
My understanding is that if we adopt findings that we're in substantial compliance, that would, until HCD specifies otherwise, that would be we wouldn't be out of compliance because we've adopted the findings, we've provided that evidence, and so then the state would need to evaluate that and then provide something in writing that says it.
Great. I understand this hasn't been litigated yet, so there might not be an answer, but I'm curious what happens if we have a project submitted under the builder's remedy after we have adopted substantial findings of compliance, getting the phrase wrong, and then HCD comes back and says, we disagree, we find that this housing element is not in compliance. Are projects that are submitted in that window eligible for the builder's remedy, or is this sort of a gray area?
As you said, that hasn't been litigated, so I don't have a firm answer.
That's fair. And then two more questions. You discussed pipeline projects and you noted how many projects have been approved already. I was curious if we have any data on how many units were approved in cycle 5, but not started by the end of cycle 5.
I believe, and Eloise, you can maybe speak to more details on this. For our annual NPRs, we're reporting on permits issued as well as approvals, and I believe the numbers are based on.
The units we built, yes. I was just curious if we have any data around, like, for example, we built 2,500 units in cycle 5, but actually 3,000 were approved, and so there's a loss percentage there. I'm curious if we're tracking any data like that.
So permitted would actually be building permits issued. Approved is that planning approval, that
Right.
discretionary approval. And so the overlap potentially could come with permits issued, but not yet occupancy granted. So that's where you can get overlap between one cycle to the next.
Okay, but in the pipeline section of the staff presentation, you reported approved, not permitted, right?
There was 3 buckets. There was
Okay.
permitted, under construction, approved, and then under review. So applications submitted but not yet approved.
And then last question, do we have any data on how many of the permitted ADUs over the past 4 years were completed and then rented as opposed to used for owner occupied reasons like a family member or a home office?
We have studies that look at the larger Bay Area, but and we are one of our programs, and we have actually been in discussion with one of the consultants for 21 Elements, the San Mateo Regional Collaborative, on ways that we can study this within San Mateo County, but we don't have any specific data for the city of San Mateo about how these units are ultimately used after construction.
Would that be tracked as part of the proposed rental registry? Like, would ADUs be one of the things that would be tracked on the rental registry?
I think that would remain to be seen depending on how we develop it.
Okay. Those are all of my questions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Can you hear me? Okay. I sent in questions earlier today, just as I was formulating them. And I don't know if I'll get to all of them, but staff has them. The first question I have is regarding the HCD review letter. And the very first comment that HCD had was, it refers to the state provision that the city must review the previous element to evaluate the appropriateness, effectiveness, and progress in implementation and reflect the results of this review in the revised element. And then the review letter from HCD stated, and I'll quote, "A thorough program by program review is necessary to evaluate the city's performance in addressing housing goals. While the element describes actual results of the prior elements programs, it must provide a description of how the objectives and programs of the updated element incorporates changes resulting from the evaluation." You mentioned in the presentation that we built 81% of the 5th cycle goal. How does the RENA allocation between the 5th and the 6th cycle compare numerically? Can you, like, what is the difference in the numbers that are required between the 5th and the 6th cycle?
The current the RENA, the housing allocation we're looking at for this housing cycle is more than double that of our last housing cycle.
Okay. So the 6th cycle is substantially higher than the 5th cycle. I'm having trouble following a succinct narrative about what policies and programs affected housing production numbers, specifically of the 5th cycle, and to what extent those policies affected production numbers. I'm also having trouble understanding how the updated element in Appendix E used lessons learned from the previous cycle that a reasonable person could see incorporated into the new housing element to produce a marked and plausible increase in housing production that's commensurate with the increase in our city's 6th cycle housing allocation. could staff provide an overview of this evaluation and how it affected the programs in the new housing element?
Do you want to start? I think what you can see is programs that carried forward were programs that were being successful, that were seeing results. And so those were carried forward. And I think what's reflected in this current housing element is a significant increase in the range and effort that's going into housing production, supporting housing production, and addressing the other statutory requirements. It's really important to differentiate between the fifth cycle and the sixth cycle. The fifth cycle started as we were coming out of the Great Recession, and there was virtually no housing units in the pipeline. And that resulted in very limited development over the first few years as the economy rebounded and housing production started again. So as entitlements started, you've now lost several years of production because housing units take so long from initial inception to actual construction and occupancy. And then the fifth cycle ended with the COVID pandemic. So I think it's important to differentiate the characteristics and how they're different between what affected the fifth cycle production that were beyond the city's control. And the other important thing is to note the significant difference in state regulatory requirements for housing to start the fifth cycle versus starting the sixth cycle. State density bonus law did not exist anywhere close to the form that it currently exists for enabling housing, allowing projects to seek concessions and density bonuses. So I think it's important to note the significant difference in climate for housing production as we start this cycle as opposed to last cycle. And so with that in mind, we have a number of programs and policies are no longer included in this, and we've replaced those with other ones. So I think it's more important to look holistically at what we're statutorily required to address in this housing element, which is meaningfully different from the last one, as well as what we want to accomplish, which is both the sites inventory requirement for our housing allocation, but also addressing the local housing needs to meet the affordability where we do recognize there's significant gaps. So I think that's kind of how we looked at it rather than doing a direct comparison. There's a lot of things that were applicable in the fifth cycle that really aren't applicable in the same way in the sixth cycle. So that was our overall approach, where we cumulatively looked at what we learned, what worked, what didn't, and then rolled all of that in to the product that is before you tonight with our current draft housing.
So thank you for that. So the thing I'm trying to grasp is we're expected to build more than double the number of units without really changing in this housing element, according to the housing element, the zoning or significant other things that are concrete. What I'm trying to figure out is what are the programs, and perhaps how are these programs influenced by the previous cycle that get us there without making that zoning change or other, zoning is just what comes to mind, but there's other programs that could increase housing production. The thing you mentioned about the rate of housing production increasing over the course of the fifth cycle, I'm curious if if we were to take, say, the last 3 years of housing entitlements, if you were to average that out and extend it through this next cycle, would that produce the double number of units that we're looking at needing to build?
I think that's supported by our pipeline projects, which account for 42% of our total RENA. And that's to start our cycle. So for total housing units, we have 42 accounted for in pipeline projects.
So, and obviously you can't get this for us today, but for the city council, would it be possible to provide kind of a projection based on more recent years to go off of what you mentioned? So it's visible to see, under status quo, this is how much we would get if the past 3 years were just replicated over the next 8. Is that something that we could do? Because I'm just curious how we're justifying doubling our housing production in general? I mean, I've read this thing over and over again.
I guess I wouldn't, I don't think status quo would be an accurate assessment of what we're going to be doing over the next 8 years, in particular, the front end of this next cycle. We've got over 75 programs that we're looking at, all of which will look at addressing constraints, production, preservation, and many other aspects of housing. So I think if you look at this housing element, there's a very robust schedule of policies and programs that will go to increasing production, supporting production on our sites inventory. And we have identified a sites inventory that has capacity to meet our sites inventory with a 42% buffer. So I think we have laid the groundwork to be successful over this 8-year period. And we have a variety of code amendments, studies, other commitments in here that will take us well beyond the status quo where we are right now.
Is the city obligated to carry out, say, a program where it states that the objective is to study or evaluate feasibility? Is it basically signing the contract with the state when a program or a policy, the objectives are to study or evaluate the potential actions? Is there anything that the state would hold us to do that?
I would say, yeah, there's a lot of legal ramifications for the housing element, and the city being obligated to follow through on the policies and programs that we've contained here. We do provide our annual progress report to the state each year, and that's a robust analysis of each of our policies and programs. How we're doing, are we sticking to our timeline? The key thing here is we've spent a significant amount of staff time putting this together, but we haven't had the bandwidth to fully evaluate each one of these. And so in some cases, our concern was making a commitment to an outcome that we don't yet know, because it might ultimately lead us to a different outcome to achieve what we're trying to get done here. So in many cases, evaluate and bring forward to City Council or the Planning Commission and City Council the findings could lead us to the best outcome. But if we committed to something else, we could then be legally challenged on not following through with that if we were that specific. And so that's what we're looking at when we say study and evaluate, is we need to spend the time to do the necessary work to bring forward that particular proposal, to figure out what is best for San Mateo, what's going to achieve the best results within whatever that policy is or that particular program. And so that's why we use the language that we did, and why in certain cases we didn't commit to a specific outcome, but because we haven't done the work yet.
Thank you. Thank you. Let me get back to my notes. So I noticed, I looked through Appendix E. Is Appendix E new from the previous submission or previous draft? Is that?
Well, it was there in the prior draft.
Okay. Okay. But has it been updated at all, or is it?
I believe there are some sections, so anything that was updated would be in red line.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. So I do have some questions after reviewing Appendix E, because it's applicable to that comment. And some of these are rather broad, and I'm not gonna hold you to answering them tonight, but I just want to bring them up because I think that's important for the housing element overall. And one of the questions I have is, how has, to use the housing element language, a divided and polarized vision for the future of the city affected housing production in San Mateo? Is that referring to such things as like Measure Y or existing city policies? What does that mean with regard to housing production?
I think we would need to go back and look at the specific context, but I think in general, as is the case with many cities around the Bay Area, it's looking at housing production over the past couple decades and recognizing that it hasn't kept pace with demand. And so it's, and then also, I think in particular, highlighting the constraint on housing that is posed by Measure Y.
How do land and construction costs? So the next section of Appendix E, and again, Appendix E is is a review of, here, let me just bring that up. Just a review of the past housing element and past prior element. So that's why I'm referring to it. The question I have is, how do land and construction costs affect the production of housing in San Mateo? It appears that the element notes that land values have increased substantially over the past decade and are higher than the state average because the amenity values attributable to the city's proximity to the coast, its mild climate, access to high-tech jobs, and plentiful amenities. How recently did San Mateo's land costs increase relative to the rest of California or the nation? Like, are they increasing at a higher rate than other areas? Is this something that we know? You can say we don't know. I'm not. Yeah.
Yeah, it's something that we would need to research further.
Okay.
Yeah, we don't have that answer right now.
Okay. And then, is there anything in this review that asks how the city's land use policies or housing development or any city policies affect the cost of land? Is that covered in the housing element? Like, what policies affect the cost of land? Because there's things that are out of our control, but I'm curious what we can do about it as a city.
I don't believe we looked at the relationship between those two specifically. We looked at our land use controls and regulations within how they create barriers or not to housing production. And then we have, I think in many cases, you have larger regional trends that affect overall property values. But no, we haven't specifically studied the correlation between those two factors.
Okay. So something I'd be curious is, like, what is the city's legal capacity to affect that? And so another comment or another aspect of that review of the past housing element is refers to outdated housing programs and policies. It says and my question is, how have outdated housing programs and policies led to the housing development numbers of the fifth cycle? And specifically Appendix B, which is related to this, notes that this is a new section. It says new housing projects with densities at 100 to 200 units per acre are not only feasible, but also necessary in order to meet the city's housing needs and support its economy. And I want to note that 100 to 200 units per acre is greater than what is currently allowed under the voter approved Measure Y and our existing codes, even when combined with state density bonus law. And also Appendix B states that overall Measure Y is a significant non-governmental constraint to housing production and affordable housing in particular in the city of San Mateo. Building community consensus around a path forward with Measure Y as part of the general plan update process is essential to meeting the city's current and future housing needs and to reducing the significant constraint on housing production. So I'm a little confused by that language, because I want to know, is the housing element claiming that the city cannot meet its RHNA under Measure Y, or can it?
We've identified a path to meet our RHNA with a 42% buffer under Measure Y. What that narrative is highlighting is how the general plan update will update densities in a way that are more aligned with what we should be developing along our transit corridors in proximity to our Caltrain stations. And it's also highlighting that under Measure Y requires us to add additional sites to meet our capacity because of the 50 dwelling unit per acre limit. So if we had higher densities, we would need fewer sites to achieve our RHNA. So I think what that narrative is highlighting is the relationship between the housing element and the general plan update process. One of the things that we do want to note, and we have received comments about rezonings and why our housing element does not include them, is that many of the sites in our sites inventory are already at the max density they can achieve under Measure Y. And so a rezoning isn't something that's even an option absent a completed general plan update process. And so that's why completion of the general plan update process and building consensus around the next chapter for what Measure Y could look like is so important to ultimately the success of the housing element as well. And that is something that will be getting done within the first year to 2 years of the housing cycle process, which aligns with when we would need to achieve our rezoning. So the general plan update process is functioning in that capacity, though outside the housing element itself because of the nature of the process.
So would you say that rezoning properties to greater densities would make it more likely that they would be redeveloped?
And anytime you increase densities, you're increasing feasibility because you're allowing increased capacity on that site.
Okay. So you mentioned, you talked about the non-vacant sites and some of the comments and letters regarding that. The state law, I'm going to read the state law section about non-vacant sites because it's kind of a point of contention, and it's going to affect the questions I have. So this is the state law. It says, when a city or county is relying on non-vacant sites to accommodate 50% or more of its housing need for lower income households, the methodology used to determine additional development potential shall demonstrate that the existing use identified does not constitute an impediment to additional residential development during the period covered by the housing element. An existing use shall be presumed to impede additional residential development absent findings based on substantial evidence that the use is likely to be discontinued during the planning period. The question I have for staff is, because this is a legal framework, would substantial evidence need to be defensible in court?
Yes. As the short answer. And substantial evidence is as you said, it's a legal framework. And what that means is it's based on facts, reasonable assumptions predicated upon facts, and expert opinion supported by facts. So the court would look at the entire administrative record to determine whether there's substantial evidence to support a certain position.
Thank you. How does, in that regard, how does evidence to the contrary, like long-term commercial leases, that was something that was mentioned, how would that affect a claim of substantial evidence? Is that just one factor of many that and then who actually determines? Is it like a judge that would sign whether that's?
So substantial evidence, as you are in the record, is, as you said, a court or a jury looking at the entire record and not one factor being determinative of the outcome. So the fact that a property is encumbered by a long-term lease is only one of many factors that could constitute substantial evidence in the record. So leases can be broken, they can be bought out, they can be terminated in so many ways. So that alone is not determinative of the outcome of whether an existing use could not be converted to a new use.
Okay, thank you. So next, the question I have, since we're looking to adopt this month, is staff claiming that the city has currently provided substantial evidence in the housing element that existing uses will be discontinued for all 183 of the non-vacant sites accommodating the cycle's lower income housing under the current zoning?
That's just not what's required by the law.
Okay.
Again, as our housing consultant pointed out earlier, this is it's like a use assessment of the sites, and it's not legally required that all the sites stop their current use and be made residential. And as Zach pointed out, you could cluster sites, new residential sites in conjunction with current uses as well. So there's no legal requirement that all of the sites be converted or all of the existing uses be immediately stopped and converted to residential use. That's just not what the law requires.
So is it just, we have to be able to show in court that we have enough evidence that it's likely?
We have to be able to show in court that we can make the findings that are spelled out in the resolution that will be presented to City Council, to show that we have legally made the findings to be able to say to HCD that we believe our housing element is legally sufficient and that we recommend that they certify it. That's what is legally required. And as that matrix lays out, there's the statutory requirements and then the findings that support them. And that's kind of the logical connection that needs to be shown in the resolution that the City Council eventually adopts and that the Planning Commission would or would not recommend to it.
So does that, if we adopt something like that, does that put the city potentially up for being sued if somebody was like, I can prove, or I can show, or I can assert that I don't think you have substantial evidence that these are going to be discontinued? Is like a legal liability to adopt this?
No, I think that we have before us a housing element and a resolution and with findings that help us make the logical leaps, or not leaps, but logical connections that we need. And I think that the housing element as presented to you is legally sufficient. And there was a second part, whether the city would be at risk of litigation. Basically, staff, as I said, believes that the housing element is legally compliant. However, parties that have exhausted their administrative remedies here would have standing to bring litigation, and then the court would weigh all of the evidence in the record and see if there's any substantial evidence to support the cause of action provided, basically, or the cause of action pleaded for and for relief.
And then I'm hearing as possibly a sticking point of confusion is maybe the discontinuance of the existing use. And just to clarify, there's no requirement that the existing use be discontinued. Mm-hmm. Housing could coexist on a site without the existing use being discontinued if there is the capacity on the site to add housing or for that use to be, I don't know, for lack of a better word, recontinued. And we've seen examples of that where a leaseholder could return with a redevelopment of a site, or where there could be sections of the site where new development capacity exists on another portion of the site. There are large sites where there's room, and we heard about Ridge Point earlier, where there's a huge parking lot, and there's room for other things on that site besides what's already there. And so there's underutilized sites where there's room for additional development, and then there are sites where there's room for redevelopment, where current leaseholders could return and continue the use that's already there. And so there's not a requirement to discontinue something. It's about the capacity for the future, not about something going away or being discontinued.
If I could just add to that, in conversations with HCD about another jurisdiction, who's a client of mine, HCD specifically said that, parking lots are really great for developing housing. And even though you might have a Target or you might have a grocery store or whatever, there are ways in which development can occur in the interstitial places. and they encourage that, as a matter of fact. So just following up on that, that the HCD is clear about that kind of infill development, if you will.
Thank you.
Mr. Nugent, may I piggyback on your question?
Yes, go ahead. Yeah.
Thank you. I think the point of confusion, you just said that there's no requirement that the use be discontinued, but the way that HCD is defining substantial evidence, it says, quote, facts, reasonable assumptions, and expert opinions supported by facts that the existing use is more likely than not to be discontinued. So I think that's potentially where the confusion is. It sounds like HCD is asking for evidence that the use will be discontinued. And as you've said, it could be recontinued, and we've seen that happen. But it still seems like we need substantial evidence that it will be discontinued, for example, for construction to happen.
All right, I don't want to beat a dead horse, so I'm gonna. Thank you. Another question that I came to after reading some comments was just a numerical question. How many inventory sites are not located on parcels zoned as either residential mixed use or within a residential overlay district? Do we know that number?
We did a preliminary calculation, and I believe for sites that were non-residential sites or non-overlay sites, I believe we had 40.
Yes, that's correct. It's 40.
Okay, and the housing element, one of the programs or policies is to change our codes to make residential and allowed use on all 40 of those properties. Is that the case?
We are proposing an addition that wasn't part of the December 30th revised draft that was published, but we are proposing that in response to the public comment that identified that concern. We are proposing that gets added to the housing element prior to adoption.
Okay, thank you.
Excuse me, would that take a CEQA?
Yeah, no, we did review that and determined because housing is allowed as a special use, but it is an allowed use in all C and E districts. It's just the question of whether it's permitted or a special use requiring a use permit. And so what we're proposing is to amend the code to allow residential as a permitted use on all sites within these districts, not just overlay sites.
So is it technically rezoning?
No,
No, it's not. It's just changing the classification of residential from being a special use to a permitted use.
and in the end, HCD would view this as a removal of a constraint. So it's in the plus column.
Okay, thank you. All right, my last line of questions is regarding funding. So funding is a major issue. And this housing element claims that the city is deficient billions of dollars. I think it was 3 or 4 billion in funding for the creation of affordable housing units. The housing element does not propose new funding sources by the city itself that would meet this this deficiency. And so it therefore implies that it cannot fulfill its RHNA without billions of dollars from the state. Is it the city's belief that as one of the wealthier cities in the state within one of the wealthiest counties in the nation, it must be reliant on taxes coming from residents beyond our city's borders to meet its RHNA?
I'll start and then Eloise, hand it off to you. What we are articulating in the housing element is that there is a significant cost associated with the housing production, particularly the affordable housing piece, because in reality, we'll only be able to rely on private development for so much, and the rest will come down to the city and partners to develop the rest of that affordable housing. And projects like Kiku Crossing will need to happen in much larger number. And as we illustrated on the slide that broke down how Kiku Crossing was funded, it started with city property and city funding, and then that was leveraged to get additional funding from the county and from the state, and then ultimately partner with Mid-Peninsula Housing to get it built. And so that's what we're highlighting right there is we would need a significant increase in funding that's available to leverage in that way in order to achieve the affordable housing needed to fully comply. So we're saying, and that was outlined in our quantified objectives, there's a challenge there, and it really does come down to funding resources to really make the difference, to have our best shot at meeting it. We've outlined our capacity, we've outlined every program that we can work toward getting as close as we can to that number, but at the end of the day, money to build these affordable units is the critical piece that we'll need in much larger quantities.
Thank you. And you noted that it was about 750,000 per unit to build affordable units or that's just a recent example?
Yeah, that was the recent example for Kiku, but I think that's comparable for other projects within the region.
It seems about right. So if an adequate amount of new revenue is not proposed within our borders or created by our state's populace as a whole, does the city believe that it has made a reasonable case to the state that the housing element is proposing adequate programs and policies to develop lower income housing, perhaps by lowering relatively high housing production costs, and should therefore receive additional funding that must presumably be diverted from other state expenditures? Is that kind of the goal of this housing element?
Well, as we mentioned earlier, and with the Kiku example, it's very common in affordable housing development to have multiple funding sources. It's very rare for, say, a city or a county to be the sole funding source for an affordable housing project. But there are programs within our housing element that we feel will be able to expand some of our funds within the city. And also, as Zach mentioned, we do have some city-owned land that we would be able to contribute to future affordable housing projects. And that would act as the leverage for additional funding sources.
How many of the sites that accommodate lower income units, or what percentage are on city-owned land? Do we know? Is that something that we could pull up?
We have Kiku Crossing, we have the Bespoke project, and we have the site on El Camino. So obviously all three of those sites would be 100% affordable, but that's still a small percentage of the total affordable within our allocation.
Okay. Thank you so much for humoring my questions. And those are all of them. So,
Well, if more come to light, feel free to. So I will jump all over the board because my questions have changed over the last 2 hours. Since cycle 5 had a RENA number of 3164, we produced 2,573, which was 81% of the number. Am I correct in understanding that less than 15% of the low and low cost housing was built?
I think we would have to check our last report on
I
that.
checked the documents was probably a couple months ago, but it showed 15% low and low cost housing, and well over 120% of affordable rate housing was built. Could be wrong, but I think it's in that area. One of the presenters this evening spoke specifically about the site-specific responses to, I guess, questions from different sources. And one of the slides said that the gold standard for picking a site is an owner or developer interested in the development. That would set.
Pardon me, if I may interject. We're hearing from some of our panelists that they're having trouble hearing you. So if you could move your mic a little closer. Thank you.
So is that better?
Yes, much.
So that's the gold standard for making the list, the site inventory. And then just a moment after that, it was stated that an owner who was not interested in expressing interest in developing their site, that it was not deemed negative, that they could still build a site, which makes some sense. Yet we are talking here essentially about an 8-year period of build that has started this month. And I think, Zach, what you said was, considering the pipeline and the amount of production that was built in RENA cycle 5, and I think your statement was housing production takes a long time from inception to occupancy as a norm. One other component that has been brought to light this evening is numerous times we've talked about the general plan update and the importance of it and how it can help the city move forward to alleviate our housing crisis. We started the general plan update, it was in 2018, okay? And we knew our housing element was due in 2023. So now, I was under the impression when we started the general plan update that our goal was to have it complete in 2021. We're now looking at 2024 after the housing element needs to be complete. Yet we are melding in the general plan update discussion as a way of alleviating and helping with the housing element. Yet the general plan update has to go to the public for an initiative to be approved. So that isn't a guarantee. So even using that as part of the discussion doesn't set well with me. We don't have a guarantee that the general plan is even going to be done in 2024, or for that matter, ratified by the voters. So I think that argument has to be set aside. Of the 2,915 pipeline projects, housing units, which has been stated as 42% of our projected 7,000 units. How many of those is Concord Passage in that pipeline?
It is, yes.
And Concord Passage would be roughly 30% of that total. 1,000 or 980 or something. You're saying we got 2,915. Correct. We had 2,915. Concord is roughly 980. Concord Passage. When did they start this process? Was it 2017? It has been 4 or 5 years.
I'm not sure when they submitted, they were entitled in 2019.
2019, okay. Since 2019, have they come back to the city with documents for permitting?
Not yet.
Not yet. Okay, so it's 2023. Typically, drawings to be submitted by from a development of that size, and to go through the permitting processes, it's 18 to 24 months. I think.
Typically.
Okay, so that brings us to minimum the end of 2025, leaving 6 years left to develop the whole site without starting until 2025 minimum. How long did it take to build Bay Meadows? Considerably larger site, but it's been 14 or 16 years they've been in production.
They've had many years in their development.
Right. So I don't, and I will only say this about this site because there are numerous other sites that I find a stretch. Concord Passage has disappeared, and we are saying is over 1/10 of the production that we are projecting over this period. There's numerous other sites that have constraints, major constraints in getting built within an 8-year period. And I think we need to acknowledge that. I think it has to be part of the discussion. We cannot say that we have put in place programs to to facilitate us within those 8 years. Sorry, that was a statement. It was a question. I'll stick to questions. We have a new policy, which is policy 4.5, which has to do with vetting all of the sites in all of the inventories, all the sites on the site's inventory, places on the site inventory. If you look at AB 686, guaranteeing affordable, aggressively furthering fair housing. First thing we were supposed to do is the outreach, which we did, and we only get less than 1% of the population of San Mateo to respond, unfortunately. Not your fault. Can't get people to respond. Second thing we were to do, we were supposed to do an assessment of the fair housing landscape. Then we were supposed to do the site inventory. Sandy Council told us the first time that we had a meeting on this issue a year ago was that council told her to put the site inventory together before the outreach or the assessments were done. You are now telling me that we have a new policy 4.5 to do the assessments. That's backwards. How can we say that our sites have been vetted through our assessment when the assessments haven't been done? Which was supposed to have been the third step in the procedure for this, for the sites together.
The assessment was done, so I'm not.
H.88.
Through the chair, if I might just interject briefly on the characterization of what policy H4.5 is. It's not an assessment of the sites on the site's inventory. This is focused on outreach to the property owners and developers associated with that. And that's basically to support and encourage development on these sites inventory, but this has nothing to do with assessment of these sites. This is focused on outreach.
Well, that's exactly what they wanted you to do, is to do the output initially during the assessment. And that's what you guys called the gold standard.
We did that outreach as part of the broader outreach, and we've spoken with many of the property owners and developers associated with the site. This is continuing that effort over the next 8 years.
I understand that, and I've talked to numerous of the developers myself also, and property owners. On page H.88, for Adam's question, I believe the statement says the city would be deficient of $4 billion to meet the RENA numbers. Of those $4 billion, $3 billion would be needed, and please correct me if I'm wrong, would be needed to facilitate the building of 1,735 low cost, very low cost, and the rehab of something like 340 existing units. Is that how that reads, that assessment?
That statement is speaking broadly to the overall affordable, the 3 affordable categories within our total RENA allocation, not the quantified objective numbers. What it's saying is that the very low, the low, and the moderate income units, in order for the city to construct those, or in order for those units to be constructed, whatever the funding might be, will be a cost that's likely to be $3+ billion.
Okay. So if you take the 1,732 units, you're saying that those units each would cost $1,732,000.
Like I just noted, the $3 billion is looking at the total RENA allocation, not the quantified objective numbers. What it's saying is that we have, I believe, around 3,000 affordable units as part of our RENA allocation. In order to build those units, whoever builds those, that's a total cost of $3+ billion. Okay. So whether that's public money or money borne by a developer as part of a market rate project, what we're saying is that those 3,000 units, so then that would be aligned with the number of around what we highlighted for per unit of around 750,000.
Well, that would be probably 2.1 billion. Yet your document says the 1,732 units would take the $3 billion. So there must be something that I'm not understanding there. I think Adam asked this question, and I don't know if we got an answer. Yet, I'd like to ask it one more time. Measure Y has been identified as a major constraint here in the city to building affordable housing. Per AB 686, if you have a height limitation in your city, you're requested to, or required to look at local jurisdictions that do not have height limitations and figure out the difference between what you've been able to produce and what they've been able to produce. Do we know what effect Measure Y has had on supplying affordable housing?
I don't believe we have any specifics on that. We don't. The short answer is we don't have a specific answer for that.
Okay, but we know it's a hindrance.
An overall housing production because it limits the density that can be achieved on any one site.
Okay. As a planning commissioner or as a housing professional, as a public interested public, how do we know when a project is being approved or vetted that it meets the AFFH requirements?
Diana, do you want to provide a response to that, or do you have any insight to that question?
I think the issue about actual development projects is different than planning for them. So the AFFH requirements are really about where are we planning for housing to be developed? If a developer wants to come in and put in, let's say, an affordable development in like North Shoreview or North Central or something, where the city has not identified those as sites for affordable development, I don't think the city would necessarily prevent that from happening. I think the real answer is it going to increase the amount of affordable housing in the community? And the answer to that is yes. I think that there are two different things happening here. One is, does the inventory, as we've set it up, as we've described it, does it meet AFFH? And the answer is, according to the analysis, yes, it does. That's the most important thing, I think, in terms of what the city has control over.
Okay, thank you for that. Roughly 30% of our projected housing inventory on our existing inventories list says that we will be producing, or we have in place programs, and we realistically feel that we will be producing 30% of that housing as low cost and very low cost. How can we make that statement when we've been able to produce considerably less in our last reading of numbers? How have we made this substantial jump?
And this is a planning, part of this is a planning issue about, do we have capacity for the units? Whether it gets built or not is a separate question than are we planning for it? And I think that the analysis, especially with the AFFH analysis, shows we have planned for it in a way that would comply with AFFH law. Whether it actually gets built is really a matter of are there funding sources? Are there developers who can actually make those projects come to fruition? The onus on the city is primarily to plan for it and make sure that it's not contributing, make sure that it's reducing the kind of constraints, local constraints to development, removing requirements like we talked about the use permit and so forth. How can we facilitate development? But the actual development of projects is not something the city can guarantee.
Thank you for that answer. And I do know we are not trying to say that we are going to guarantee anything. Yet, back to the first meeting when Sandy Council brought this to the commission, she said that evening that there was no way we will be building our RETA number for affordable housing. Yet, we are saying that there is a realistic capacity and a strong feasibility of 30% of these housing units being built as low cost. That's what our documents say. So we can say, and then at the same time, we're saying we're $3 billion short, so it's not going to happen. So I'm just trying to formulate a response to a variety of different ways that we're saying we can build it, we're facilitating it, yet we actually can't. That is it for my questions for now. Would people like to take a break or should we go to public comment?
Through the chair, as we've been asking questions, I have a couple more, if that would be okay. Can we see the slide again about the pipeline really quickly? I think something that I've been struggling with listening to this discussion is a little bit of this, you know, we're saying X, but we're also saying Y. And I was curious about that 42% of our allocation is in the pipeline number. And I asked this before, which was, we have approved a lot of units that haven't been built. For example, Concord Passage is approved. I understand there's a 15-year development agreement. Is that correct? And that they've already asked for 2 one-year extensions since being approved. Am I mistaken? For Concord Passage?
It's several years. I would have to look at the exact number. If it's 12 or 15, I am not aware of any extensions.
Okay. I thought they applied, okay, but basically.
Usually they wouldn't ask for an extension until they came up against their deadline. So it'd be very unusual to ask for an extension this early. And I don't think we would be.
Okay.
It would have to come before you to have one granted.
Sure. I must be mistaken. But essentially they have 12 or 15 years from when we approved the project to actually hold the permit, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So when we say that our pipeline project units 2,915, that is including units under review and units approved. But we know that Concord Passage has 15 years to pull permits for that project, right?
From 2019.
From 2019. But that still could extend beyond, right? We've got 2019 to 2031 is 11 years. So they theoretically have beyond cycle 6.
Sure, or they could come in next year.
I guess what I'm asking is very specific is, as you mentioned, the numbers we report for RETA are our permitted numbers for our completions, right? So would it be more consistent to just for this total pipeline projects to just report the ones that have been permitted as opposed to the ones that have been approved and under review, because we have less certainty about those being completed?
The tabulation of pipeline projects is consistent with state law and what HCD accepts as being a pipeline project. And so all 3 of those categories meet that definition and can be counted as pipelines, because with our annual progress reports, we report on applications, we report on permits, and we report on occupancy.
I see. Okay, thank you. So that's an official definition. Got it. There was during the staff presentation, there were two bullet points on slides that I noted, which is, we talked about this a little bit, presence or absence of long leases is by itself not determinative, and current owner disinterest does not necessarily preclude inclusion on the site inventory. Are those two statements that we've heard from HCD directly in any of their documentation, or are those sort of assumptions by us, given the broader context
It's
of
been
what
definitely
we need to provide?
the guidance that we have, which is 44 pages, tells us things we should look for. And that's what I was trying to say with the things to consider: age of development, et cetera, et cetera. All these things are in the 44-page document. There is nothing in there that is specific. Oh, if there are long leases and the project is, for example, or the development is, say, really old and falling apart and they're whatever. These are things that we have to look at it in totality. And so there's nothing definitive to say a long lease is prohibitive. And as I said in my example, the project in the East Bay, completely leased up with new leases, long leases for an office building. Developer came in, bought it up, basically said, I'm going to do affordable housing here, a combination of affordable housing and market rate housing. So in and of itself, there's nothing in the law that says if it has a long lease, you can't include it. This is what we need to look at and factor in.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. I'm not sure how to formulate this into a question, but I think I have a question here, which is, I see a tension in all of these questions between what is theoretically possible, what are we legally required to do, versus what is realistic and what is likely. And my understanding, having read through many of the HCD guidance documents, site inventory guidebook, is that we're supposed to be showing a realistic capacity. We're supposed to be showing what is likely to happen. But my concern is the way that we're discussing some of this and phrasing this language is, it seems like we're focusing on what is theoretically possible or what is legally possible. And so, I'm curious, like, how many of those sites on the inventory have long leases? Because yes, theoretically, developers could come buy out all of those sites with all of those long leases, but is it likely that that would happen for every single one of those sites? Do we have any kind of breakdown on, maybe that will come later as part of the table you're developing, where we would be able to look and see, how many of those sites currently have a long lease, or how many of those sites, what are the different factors in play, and like, what is the preponderance of evidence across all the sites saying?
Well, I think we want to highlight that we have a 42% buffer, so we don't need every site on the inventory to develop to meet our RENA. We also anticipate very likely that there's going to be sites not on the site's inventory that get developed with housing. And so the threshold isn't every site on the inventory, and that's why you have a buffer. We are aware of leases on many of the sites. There's probably other sites that have them that we're not aware of. But as we've outlined in various ways, it's the totality of evidence on a site, and it's a demonstration of capacity and feasibility. And statutory compliance is what we're looking for. That's the threshold to be deemed ultimately, or to ultimately be certified, is statutory compliance. And then beyond that, it's what we have to look at locally as what we can achieve.
So it seems to me that we've established at some point as a goal as the city that our goal is statutory compliance, as opposed to our goal being the realization of the actual development of units.
It's both. Those aren't mutually exclusive.
Okay. I think that's all my questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Can we move to public comments? And do we go actually, could we take a 5-minute break? You good with that?
Here, why don't we do first, so we don't make people wait. Yeah.
Fine, let's go.
Vice Chair Netter, quick question for you. We have, first I would ask anybody via Zoom if they would like to speak to raise their hand so we can get a count. We'll give them a second to do that. And then, there's hands being raised, so just give me a minute. So at this time, we have 2 in-person speakers and 5 via Zoom. And we will do the in-person speakers first, but we want to give me a time limit of how many minutes you'd like for each speaker.
3 minutes is fine.
Okay, we'll go with 3 minutes. So our first speaker is Carl Eldridge. Okay. Yes.
Good evening.
Yes.
Good evening, Commissioners. Woo. Thank you for the opportunity to offer remarks this evening. My name is Carol Eldridge, and I'm speaking this evening on behalf of One San Mateo, of which I am the Vice Chair. I would like to call attention to a particular entry that appears in 2 different places in the goals, policies, and programs chart in the housing element. It appears both under H3, which is titled Protection of Current Residents to Prevent Displacement, and also under H5, which is titled Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing. The entries in question call for the expansion of the substantial renovation provisions of AB 1482. One San Mateo has advocated for this expansion, and we were delighted to see that they were incorporated in the housing element. Our concern, though, is the timetable that is set for these changes. The timetable is 2025 and 2026. The City Council has heard testimony from renters who were evicted in anticipation of substantial remodels. But the substantial remodels never occurred. Under AB 1482, one of the defining criteria for a substantial remodel is that it be work on a scale that a permit is required. Well, in these instances that I'm citing, no permits were ever pulled. The policies that One San Mateo has supported involve, for one thing, that the permit actually be in hand before the tenants be evicted. This would definitely help to prevent future abuses. They also call for enhanced relocation benefits and the right to return on the part of the tenant at the new rent. These changes would help ensure that tenants are treated humanely and that they have a shot at remaining in our community. At the Blue Skies event last year, these policy changes were made priority 1, top priority. The current housing element pushes them forward another 2 years to 2025, 2026. I think we need to be clear about the fact that this delay is not without its costs. There are renters in the community who will be abused and hurt during these 2 years, and I don't think that we should be cavalier about that. So our ask of the commission tonight is that it make a recommendation to the City Council that the timeline for these substantial renovation policy changes be moved up, ideally to the current year. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Our next speaker is Jennifer Martinez. Jennifer, you can step up to the microphone.
Good evening, Commission. Thank you for allowing us to comment on this. And thank you for the robust interrogation and discussion earlier. There are a couple of, I want to speak to three things. One is I want to underscore what Carol has talked about and ensure that we advance the further tenant protections where we know there are significant loopholes in existing policy. The second is I was really struck by the conversation about funding. And it seems that that is a huge hole in what our current housing element plan is. And we should assert an intention to raise the sufficient revenues that are required in order to build the kind of housing that our community needs most, which is very low, extremely low, low income housing. And then the third thing I want to comment on, and I submitted a letter about this as well, is I still have deep concerns about the affirmatively furthering fair housing approach that this housing element takes. While there has been work to address the areas where there are a majority people of color, majority low-income people, and people with disabilities in our neighborhoods, what I do not see is any advance or very little to advance the building of housing, or particularly low-income housing, in neighborhoods that are affluent and, by definition of the maps that were shown on in one of the attachments, 80 to 90% white. And there aren't programs in our current housing element to support the development of further housing, particularly low-income housing in those communities. I would like to see us be more assertive in that area, because that is in fact how we are going to affirmatively further fair housing. There is still housing. There's housing in high resource opportunity areas or higher resource opportunity areas, but that actually isn't addressing the racial segregation that is clearly demonstrated in our maps. So I want us to find ways to push that further in this cycle so we don't continue the segregation that we have seen historically. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Our next speaker is Mitch Siegel. Mitch, you can go up to the microphone.
Hey everyone, how you guys doing? My name is Mitch. I'm a small business owner and I rent in District 5. I wanted to thank you guys for allowing this forum, and I really thought it was a great points you guys made about how arduous the timelines for building here in San Mateo are and how massive the cost is to build. $750,000 per unit of affordable housing, that's massive. And with a multi-billion-dollar shortfall, we need to incentivize private investment. There's no other way to get that kind of housing built. This is an educated group, and you guys know as much as I do, most for rent product, especially non-ultra luxury stuff, doesn't pencil. If it doesn't pencil, it does not get built. This is an educated group. We know this. To incentivize private investment, I have a question that I and other San Mateans have asked, but haven't been able to get a clear answer. What is the minimum viable product of required study and expansion of the state rent control in order to have the local adoption necessary to avoid the builder's remedy versus what the current language is? Specifically, table 11, 3.4, and 3.6. Not too many years ago, 60% of San Mateans voted and spoke with those votes against citywide rent control. And despite that, and the will of San Mateans, rent control with many of the same rent restrictions in table 11 was enacted at the state level. Right now, we have new rent control and restrictions in San Mateo that are already above the level that San Mateans want. This de-incentivizes investment and de-incentivizes the will of people to become housing providers and to create rental stock. The reason why 60% of San Mateans spoke out against these very restrictions and language in the housing element that's been put forward is that it de-incentivizes building. It lowers the supply. These programs directly negatively impact small mom and pop housing providers, which are the backbone of our missing middle housing stock. Many of those are actually people of color, especially in low-income areas like North Shoreview, and many of which are still recovering from COVID moratoriums, where they shoulder much of the burden for this city. By adding additional restrictions via the housing element, we undermine those housing providers and the will of San Mateans. Currently, language doesn't allow San Mateans to vote on these steep restrictions to private property rights, and again, further de-incentivizes the creation and promotion, as this panel stated, the immensely important missing middle stock by increasing costs and liability for providers and developers of this housing. We need to incentivize development and creation of rental stock. So I would ask this panel again, what is the minimum viable product of required study and expansion of the state rent control in order to have the local adoption necessary to avoid the builder's remedy versus the de-incentivizing currently? I have asked that question before. I've never gotten a response, and I would love one. Thank you guys for your time.
Thank you.
Our first speaker via Zoom is Ali Saperman. Ali, you can go ahead and unmute yourself.
Hi, good evening. My name is Ali Saperman. I will be speaking on behalf of the Housing Action Coalition. I understand that you've received a letter from my council and you will hear their public comment later tonight. The housing element is not ready to be approved at this time because it is not currently compliant with state law. In our letter, we identify a number of sites that have current uses that we don't expect will be developed at the density identified in the site inventory. I really appreciate all the work that staff and the commission has done to respond to our letter tonight and the staff presentation. With that, staff noted that the active leases aren't enough to discount these sites, that there is additional evidence that proves that these sites will be developed. Staff also mentioned that there could be coexisting use, but I'd like to note that there wasn't a demonstration that a likelihood of that will happen. I do appreciate that analysis. However, I still hold some additional concerns. We identified that these sites are either unrealistic for development and that we believe some of these sites have overestimated the amount of units that can be built under the current zoning allowed under Measure Y. We believe that this creates a shortage and it is a legal burden for the city to prove that sites identified in the inventory will be developed. As such, we ask the city to identify additional sites to create a buffer. And if that is not possible, the city must override Measure Y and we cannot wait for an election to repeal because it is important that it complies with HCD, which holds a higher authority over Measure Y. Additionally, we ask that the city makes a firm commitment that the sites in the site inventory will be developed with clear deadlines for implementation. This is particularly critical for sites like the Hillsdale Mall, which holds a large portion of the housing stock. We ask that you not recommend this incomplete housing element to the council just to rush and meet a deadline, but instead take a little more time to try to get it right. Should not choose a path that ends with the state or a court telling you that the housing element is invalid. You should try to keep control of the process, choosing how you want to comply with state law and provide housing for this community that we all know and love. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Our next speaker is Kenneth Doe. Kenneth, you can go ahead and unmute yourself.
Good evening, Planning Commissioner. My name is Kenneth Doe. I'm a field rep for the Carpenters Union, Local 217, representing thousands of construction workers living throughout San Mateo County. I'm encouraged by the idea of bringing more development like this to our community because greater density makes the property more accessible and benefits the people that want to live and work in San Mateo. The housing element is great because it provides housing for all income level. I noticed the update draft of the 2023 housing element. There are no labor standard in place. I kindly ask you have some labor standard in place. Labor standard language in place would ensure contractors pay fair wage, use experienced, well-trained workers, this leads to higher quality workmanship, meeting building standard, and completing the project quickly. Prevailing wage, support for a valuable apprentice program, healthcare for construction workers, and a workable local hire are all critical elements to ensuring the city of San Mateo has and will have in the future the workforce necessary to build the housing this community desperately needs, while achieving and exceeding the policy goals outlined in the housing element. The NorCal Carpenters Union believes that stronger language and a labor commitment on the following policy areas will enhance San Mateo general plans and his vision for the future. These developers will never do the right thing and pay area standard wages on their own. With your leadership, we could send a message to all developers of the San Mateo area. We would not stand for the exploitation of carpenters, skilled tradesmen, and apprentices so they can increase their profits. We would love to have a real valuable meeting with each and every one of you to answer questions you have about what labor violation is and what labor standards should look like. For all these reasons, the Carpenter urges the city of San Mateo adopt these labor standards as requirement for any developer planning to build in our city. We look forward for your support And thank you for your time.
Thank you, Ken.
Our next speaker is CJ Higley. CJ, you can go ahead and unmute yourself.
Thank you, Commissioners. My name is CJ Higley from the law firm of Farella, Braun and Martell, commenting on behalf of the Housing Action Coalition. In our comment letters, we explained a number of deficiencies in the draft housing element, including improperly identifying sites that are not likely to be available for development during the planning period, and generally overestimating the number of units that are realistically likely to be built. And I appreciate a lot of the conversation between staff and the commission earlier addressing this issue. Needless to say, I think that the deficiencies we identified in our letters still exist in the draft element. And the upshot is that, we continue to believe that the current draft is flawed and not legally defensible. I mean, I urge you to refer to our letters for more details on our detailed comments. But with that backdrop, and in addition to the deficiencies we've already identified, we have some recommendations for staff and the commission. Our comment letter demonstrates that your inventory is not big enough to accommodate the next 8 years of need for housing. And it's not big enough because it includes unrealistic sites, and also because it overestimates how much each, or at least many of the sites, will provide. So we see really two possible solutions. One is to identify more sites and make sure that they're ones where it's likely that the existing use will cease, or that the uses are compatible in a way that the sites are likely for development. And if the conclusion is that there truly are no additional realistic housing sites in the city that haven't already been included, then you should commit to rezoning sites to permit construction that might otherwise violate Measure Y, and explain that you need to do this in order to satisfy state law. The dense development that staff envisions on, for instance, the parking lot sites that serve Hillsdale and Bridgepoint come to mind here. We believe that you shouldn't just wait and hope that Measure Y is repealed in 2 years. You have an obligation to
CJ, we can't hear you anymore.
then you have to follow state law. We'd be happy to discuss this approach further with your city attorney. Thank you.
Thank you, CJ.
Our next speaker is Luis Duncalf. You can go ahead and unmute yourself.
Hi, I live off of Norfolk, and I thought tonight I saw where they weren't going to have one area that is getting all these sites to build things, but it looks like it is. There's the fish market site they're thinking of using. Bridgepoint isn't that far from our area where the fish market is. I saw on the list that they want to use the atrium. Well, the atrium is right next to a building site. There's already built condos and pretty high condos. And the Parkside Plaza, that would be another area. And if you count the Concord area, that's all just in one area where we live. And I thought that was, you said that you weren't going to have one area of San Mateo have all the buildings. And just by going the list, I saw that was going to be not true. Thank you.
Thank you, Luis.
We have one more in-person public speaker, Jordan Grimes. You can go ahead and step up to the microphone.
Evening, staff, commissioners. I'll keep this brief. This was one of the more disappointing meetings that I've attended in my 30 years in the city, but it is what it is. A couple quick points. I respectfully disagree with Mr. Spiegel. What's disincentivizing construction of housing are zoning controls, such as Measure Y, not rent controls, which do not apply to new construction, I think, as we all know. I'm glad that Measure Y is now correctly described as a major constraint and impediment to the construction of affordable housing in San Mateo. I am frustrated, however, that despite the analysis, there is no mitigation proposed. The city is required to analyze and mitigate constraints, and holding community conversations to build consensus for a potential ballot measure will not be deemed an acceptable mitigation by HCD. Indeed, it is not a mitigation at all. There is some discussion tonight about guarantees and the notion that the city cannot guarantee anything will be built. That's absolutely true, but that is not and has not been what the city has been asked to do. We have been asked and expected to analyze constraints to development and to mitigate them. What is being asked is that we correctly assess what is going on in the city to prevent development, to prevent the construction of housing, and to do something about it, to create policies and programs to make it easier to actually create the housing we need. I don't see that in the housing element right now. On the topic of leases, the reality is that long-term leases significantly decrease the likelihood of redevelopment, significantly reduce development potential. HCD has been very clear about this. It's a significant impediment and should be acknowledged. That's it for me tonight. Thank you.
Thank you. So, Mary, no one else online?
We do have one more speaker via Zoom. It's Moises Valletta. You can go ahead and unmute yourself.
Good evening, Chair and Commissioners. Thank you for the opportunity to allow me to speak tonight. My name is Moises Valletta. I'm also a field representative of Carpenters Union, Local 217. We serve in San Mateo County. I'm not gonna reiterate or repeat what my counterpart Ken has already expressed, but what I want to take the time is to bring to your attention something that I find very important. It's the 2023-2031 Housing Element City of Redwood City HCD Reviewed Draft Version 2 Revised January 2023. On page 49, policy H-5.7 reads, encourage developers and contractors to evaluate hiring local labor, hiring from contributing to apprenticeship programs, increasing resources for labor compliance, and providing livable wages. This is tremendous because they see the value in what the carpenters bring in building the much needed housing we have. And it also steers the developers to use responsible general contractors. In short, I'm not going to ask you to follow Redwood City, but I'm going to ask you to join Redwood City in taking the same stance and implementing such language that would help provide that much needed housing and ensure that we have a skilled, highly trained workforce for future developments in decades to come, not just for housing, but hospitals, office buildings, county buildings, et cetera, et cetera. It is tremendously important. Also, it's important because it helps maintain and continue to elevate the middle class. It keeps people from going into poverty. Such language also prevents irresponsible developers and their contractors, general contractors, to further exploit workers on such projects, because this happens on a daily basis. I strongly encourage you to consider it and implement it. Respectfully, I thank you for your time.
Thank you, Moises.
That was our last speaker.
Thank you. And since it looks like any public who could speak already has, unless there's somebody who wants to come forward. Otherwise, we'll close the public comment period. And please take a 10-minute recess. Thank you. So we'll bring the meeting back to order. With the close of public comment, we will bring it back to any more comments, questions, or statements before we go to the voting portion of the evening. Adam, would you like to continue, or Seema, either one?
Sure, I'll comment first and then we can move on. So first I want to say, make sure everybody can hear me. Okay. First I want to say that this housing element is enormous and it requires a lot of time to review. And that just shows me that there's been so much staff and consultant time that's been put into this. And I want to commend staff for all the work they've done. It is huge undertaking. There's also a lot of stuff in it that really, you know, maybe you can't tell by my questioning, but it really does make me excited. And it does make me hopeful for the future. And so I do want to say that I appreciate the work you've done. I also believe that there are many meaningful areas within the housing element that need still improvement or don't significantly modify or solve problems that are listed by the state's HCD reviewer. And so I'm just going to go through some of my thoughts on that. Overall, I doubt that HCD will find this housing element as it currently stands in substantial compliance with state law. That's not to take away any of the efforts. I mean, it is an iterative process. I don't think between now and January 31st, I doubt that the city council or members of the general public would be able to decipher, you know, with certainty whether staff has accomplished the necessary requirements that are outlined in state law and HCD guidance. I think that that's difficult, and it's going to be somewhat kind of see what we need to see what HCD says when they review. But here's what I just want to highlight where I think that we could still improve. And I'm going to start with the site inventory and methodology surrounding the site inventory. I don't believe that the realistic capacity of sites in the site inventory has been factored in a way that is in accordance with HCD guidance. The guidance notes that past production trends must be used, which is clearly noted as the rate at which similar sites have been developed, including whether or not a site will be redeveloped at all, where there's not substantial evidence that it's going to be developed. And past production trends are different than typical densities of previous projects, which is another factor that I do see incorporated into the city's site capacity calculations. So that would affect the number of sites that would be necessary or the programs that would be required to encourage development based on, you know, an analysis of past production trends. The San Mateo housing element has a large number of sites that do not seem to have a realistic likelihood of becoming housing during the next 8 years. I would love for them to become housing over the next 8 years, but I don't see a strong, in a sense, narrative or program base that gives me much, obviously not certainty, but much confidence that we're going to meet our housing production requirements as it stands. And I think that the recent letters from the Housing Action Committee and the Sierra Club are very helpful And there's also some very thorough critiques of the current draft from those two letters, and I appreciated reading them. I don't know, I've talked a lot about the site inventory methodology in the previous review, so I don't necessarily need to go or want to go to that. I think that just as kind of my bottom line is it really depends on what it means for us as far as the what are we going to find reasonable for a site to be converted from its existing use to housing. Like, how much substantial evidence do we have for that? And it depends, like what does that mean? And it just doesn't seem like we currently have that substantial evidence for all the sites that would accommodate lower income. So I'm going to move on to goals, policies, and actions. And I think that this is where there's both the most hope for the housing element, and also areas where it's more clear or more clear cut that there's deficiencies to me. To start, and this is just to kind of piggyback off of some recent public comment, the region will need a substantial increase in home building to meet the Bay Area's RHNA. And we will also need to grow the workforce necessary to build housing at a rate necessary to accomplish this growth. And so I do think I would like to see something that's legal within the city's power that can protect labor standards, especially for larger projects, that are not ADUs or something, and smaller projects, and encourage developers to provide livable wages to workers. I think that is a helpful tool that we could incorporate, because people who build our homes also live here, and the cost of living, which is related to our lack of building homes, is a major factor in us being able to have the workforce necessary to build the housing. So that aside, I'm going to go a little bit more into what existing content is there for the goals, policies, and actions. Save for some policies that are specifically required by state law, I see that most of the meaningful goals, policies, and actions are not substantially committal to exact programs or even actually occurring beyond, like, say, a study. And now I totally understand that it's important to evaluate and study and figure out what's the best path forward for some really good potential programs. Unfortunately, I'm under the impression that that sort of stuff should have happened in, say, our general plan process years in advance of this point. And so we've kind of backed ourselves into a corner in that sense. And so I'm not sure how much weight HC will give policies that really don't commit to necessarily doing anything beyond staff actions. Which is unfortunate, because there's some good things that could happen. This is especially the case with the affirmatively furthering fair housing. And so I'm going to jump into that, because it seems to me that there's even more stringent requirements around that with regard to goals, policies, and actions. Backing up, and I talked a lot about AFFH in the previous review, and I'm just going to say this again: the structural inertia toward greater segregation within the Bay Area is actually growing. And today, the Bay Area is more racially segregated than it was in 1970. most neighborhoods in the United States are more segregated than they were in 1990. And schools today are more segregated than they were in the 1960s. That means we are failing 100% as a nation, as a region, and as a city when it comes to affirmatively furthering fair housing. There's a lot of history to that, and there's a lot that can be said. So in order to make meaningful change and bend that inertia toward greater desegregation and greater equity, we're going to need meaningful and substantial changes to do that. And I see in HCD's comment letter stating that goals, actions, metrics, and milestones. So this is just to quote the HCD letter. And before I quote that, I just want to say it's unfortunate, and I don't want to put any blame on staff or consultants or anything for having it at this stage. It's just, it is what it is. And we just need to have a plan to move forward. And I don't want to lose programs that have potential to be good. That's a big thing. But anyways, the HCD's comment letter states that goals, actions, metrics, and milestones. The element must be revised to add or modify goals and actions based on the outcomes of a complete analysis of AFFH. And goals and actions must specifically respond to the analysis and to the identified and prioritized contributing factors to fair housing issues, and must be significant and meaningful enough to overcome identified patterns and trends. And so, just to pause from that quote, in order to know whether or not, or not even know, just estimate or guess, make a general guess whether an action or policy is going to be significant and meaningful enough to overcome identified patterns and trends, we need to have some sort of metric to judge it by. And it needs to be based on the data that we have developed there's lots of data in our housing element. All right, so to go back to the HCD comment, actions must have specific commitment, metrics, and milestones as appropriate, and must address housing mobility enhancement, new housing choices and affordability in high opportunity areas, place-based strategies for community preservation and revitalization, and displacement protection. I mean, yes, we need that. That would be amazing. We would do so much progress in the city if we had all of those things, and it was a strong and firm commitment to those things. Again, the quote is over. In the housing element, there are some very commendable efforts to begin to address this knotty problem, but currently our AFFH related actions and our means of evaluating their effectiveness are too weak to make meaningful change in the direction of affirmatively furthering for housing. It's possible that the programs produce good results, but I don't have strong confidence as they are right now, because things could go sideways, and we have too much open in our housing element that would allow potential things going sideways. There's a lot of still like future discretion, in a sense, lack of commitments. But again, I really do appreciate many of the policies that are introduced. For instance, policy H5.4.5, and I'm going to quote it: ensure that future improvements in disadvantaged communities will not produce a net loss of affordable housing or the displacement of residents, and seek to increase the amount of affordable housing in disadvantaged communities. End quote. That is an amazing policy. I'm so glad we have that in there. I don't know, I don't see that we have the commitment to achieve that policy in a measurable way yet, but it's getting there. At the moment, this particular policy only commits to studying the feasibility of some action. And by the definition of HCD's comment, that's not a quantifiable quantifiable objective and it's not metric based. And that's unfortunate because, again, this would be an amazing policy. I really want to see concrete actions in place that could actually produce this policy goal. And this goal, like many others, needs to be paired with programs that measurably reduce the concentration of low-income residents in disadvantaged communities. And so we need to be able to do that and produce a decrease in the concentration of low-income residents in one place of the city without the displacement. That probably means we're going to need to build more housing. Another thing, part of this goes into the objectives and the quantified objectives of the AFFH portion. The objectives and quantified objectives must incorporate the data and analysis of the fair housing assessment in order to produce actual quantifiable targets that meaningfully rectify, among other things, the stark disparities in affordability, housing access, overcrowding, concentrations of disadvantaged demographics and low opportunity census tracts in the physical conditions of our neighborhoods occupied by lower income residents, as well as the creation of solid displacement protection programs. So the ideal would be for somebody who could to read this and see mapped out, okay, we have, say, 20% overcrowding in the census tract, mapped out using a program that it shows there's going to be this much activity of some sort that reduces overcrowding by 5% by X time. That is what a good program would look like. And that would be how we would know that that program is going to be effective or potentially could be effective at this stage when we're making a contract basically with the state. And we're not quite there yet. Again, I don't want to lose these great policies, but they're not quite fleshed out as they should be. And it's hard work. Like, I don't envy your positions. Like, this is unlike anything that's been done, really, at a local level. And we're being asked to do a lot because there's a major task ahead of us to do. My confidence that an adequate amount of subsidized affordable units will be created equitably throughout the city over the course of this upcoming cycle is also extremely low based on the programs and the sites inventory put forth in the housing element as it stands. And I think that the creation of subsidized affordable units is inextricably tied to affirmatively furthering for housing. And we're not quite there yet because I don't see a program that to me, or programs that to me tell me that we're actually going to meet our required arena. There isn't a narrative that says to me, oh, we did this last cycle. We're going to do this other stuff this cycle, and it's going to produce this result. We have stuff that we're going to do, but we have no idea what's going to come of it. So as they stand, most new goals, policies, and actions still take the form of a schedule to produce loosely defined actions with few set metrics. I've said metrics a lot. And that's unfortunate. Like, I get it. We need to be able to do the work to put them in place. But at the very least, we should have goals that we can look at and say, did we meet them or not? And we don't have that. So the work could be done and it could produce absolutely nothing. It could be just a waste of hours and hours and hours of staff time, of volunteer time. And according to this housing element, that would be compliant. I don't think that's going to pass. As they stand currently, most new goals, policies, and I already read that, sorry. And I'm getting close to being done. So at best, most new policies, quantified objectives are simply schedules to create vaguely specified programs at some point in the course of the housing elements timeline without actual commitments, and almost no means for the public to adjudicate the potential effectiveness of the programs in fixing the fair housing issues outlined in the AFFH documentation. So this doesn't provide the city any means of predicting in advance or evaluating the effectiveness of the programs in the future based on actual quantified objectives. So we need to do the work of creating specific metrics and milestones. They're vitally important. We're vitally important. They're vitally important. And without them, I fear the city will continue the disparities and the segregation it currently sanctions through policy inertia. So important, meaningful change can only be anticipated and planned for when measurable outcomes that address the fair housing assessment are specified. And I understand that staff is wary of creating commitments that the state could potentially hold the city to. But that's the whole point of this housing element. That's the whole point of the FFH, is to create commitments that the state is going to hold us to. And I don't know how to jive that. Again, there's some great potential in these programs. Like, it makes me smile when I read the policies of some of them. And I don't know where to go from here. I can't. Yeah, nobody's going to be able to wave a magic wand and create the required metrics that I anticipate HCD will ask us for. So those are my comments at this point.
Thank you, Adam.
Yeah.
Appreciate it. Seema, are you ready?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
One quick comment before I go into some of my notes. There was some discussion in the question period around the funding necessary to build our allotment of low income and very low income housing. I was just going through and looking at the tables. I think it's like 2,800 total is our allocation of low and very low units. And one thing we talked a lot about is the lack of funding. It costs $750,000 per affordable unit, roughly, where we have a $3 billion to $4 billion shortfall to create those affordable units. Where is that funding going to come from? And one thing I didn't hear anybody mention or discuss is that because of our inclusionary zoning program, the creation of market rate housing above 10 units results in the creation of affordable housing. So one way we could get that entire allocation of 2,800 low and very low income units is actually by building, whipped out my calculator, 18,667 market rate units. And so I wonder why we don't talk about that in our housing element, why we don't suggest, I mean, there's a balance there, right? We can't only create affordable housing through that. That's an incredibly large number of units. It's like quadruple our allocation in total. But it is one way to create affordable units, is to create more market rate units. And so I was just thinking that maybe we should discuss that, and maybe we should talk about that. And if we can create better incentives for market rate development, then that will lead to more creation of affordable units through the inclusionary zoning program.
Can I, since you had done that calculation, I actually did a similar calculation recently based on the 3 to 4 billion that we would need to create affordable units. And that would be like $30,000 to $40,000 in taxes that we would have to increase per capita in our city, including children, over the course of this housing element. So, amortized across the housing element. Like, that's not going to happen. And imagine the fact that most of California is not as wealthy as San Mateo.
Right.
Like we like we can't just beg state for money. It'd be nice, but that would be $1 trillion if you were to calculate that out across the entire population of California. It's not like we are a state. We can't print that money.
Yeah. Okay, so going into some of my notes, I think like Commissioner Nugent, I want to acknowledge the significant amount of time and effort that's gone into producing this housing element. I know that our staff started working on this at least 18 months ago, I think potentially longer, and that it hasn't been an easy process. And as Commissioner Nugent said, it took an incredible amount of time to read it. And so I can only imagine the amount of time that went into making it. It's a huge body of work. And I really appreciate the time and effort that's gone into it. I think like Zach mentioned, I also want to call out that this isn't cycle 5. A lot has changed since cycle 5. I was reading through HCD's technical guidance last week, and even they said, state law has changed significantly since 5th cycle housing elements were adopted, and it would be unlikely that a 5th cycle housing element would substantially comply with current state law. So a lot has changed, and a lot has changed in the last 2 years even. HCD has issued quite a few guidance memos and clarifications. They've staffed up their housing element reviewers from 15 to 80. They created a new enforcement unit of 25 personnel. I myself have noticed that there's a stark difference in the response letters received by SANDAG cities, that's San Diego government area, in the spring of 2021 versus the response letters being received by ABAG cities right now. It's just a huge change in a very short amount of time. In an amount of time in the past 2 years where our city has been navigating an unprecedented pandemic, the resulting economic downturn, we've had to continue to make meaningful progress on our general plan. We've moved to district-based elections. We've brought several local regulations and ordinances into alignment with changing state law. And most recently, responding to an atmospheric river bomb cyclone parade situation. I think it would be difficult to stay on top of all of the changes to state law and housing element guidance under normal circumstances, much less during this period of incredible amount of change locally. There's been a lot on everyone's plates. And obviously that's one of the reasons that we rely on expert consultants who have the experience and have the time to help us navigate this process. And, as a former council member pointed out, those of us that are sitting at this table are not professionals. We're volunteers. I haven't been working on housing elements for 30 years. I've been looking at housing elements for 15 months. It's not a long time, but I've tried to, as much as possible in that time, educate myself on this process. And, I think I mentioned before, I've done my best to watch all the webinars and read the site inventory guidebook and read the guidance memos and the clarifications. And I've been reading response letters to SCAG and ABAG cities. And I even read a few of other peninsula cities' housing element drafts just to see what they're doing and how it compares to what we're doing. This is the 4th time, I think, that this planning commission is discussing this cycle 6 housing element. And I think all of us in our previous meetings have expressed some concerns about various aspects of compliance with HCD requirements in state law. And then we discussed this in the questions. The staff report notes that in some circumstances, HCD certification is not required for a housing element to be found substantially compliant with state law. If HCD determines that a housing element does not substantially comply with state law, a jurisdiction must either revise the document to implement HCD requirements or adopt its own findings explaining why it complies with the statute despite HCD's comments. So as it turns out, there is a judicial definition of substantial compliance, and it means, quote, actual compliance in respect to every reasonable objective of the statute. That's from Camp versus Board of Supervisors in 1981. And so as I read that, it means for us to declare ourselves in substantial compliance, we actually have to meet every single objective of the statute. We have to meet every single one of those that list of requirements. We can't just meet most of them or many of them. And I continue to have many of the same concerns that I've previously expressed. And so I disagree with some of the assertions in Exhibit A of the staff report, where we attempt to demonstrate that the housing element is in compliance with all of the statutory provisions in the government code. And per this previous case law, it seems like if we're not in compliance with all of them, then we're not in substantial compliance. And like Commissioner Nugent, you know, I've discussed some of my concerns in previous meetings in detail, and so I don't want to spend a lot of time doing that again, but I'll kind of summarize where my biggest concerns are. For the site inventory, we're not providing substantial evidence of redevelopment as defined by HCD, which we've already talked about what their definition is. We're assuming 100% zone density production for residential zone parcels based on a calculation of as-built density that includes projects that have not yet started construction and appear on the Cycle 6 inventory. We eliminated projects that didn't include any housing from our calculation of as-built density in mixed use and commercial zones, which significantly overestimates the realistic capacity of those sites. And we don't identify previous constraints or new incentives to develop sites that have appeared on our Cycle 4 and Cycle 5 inventories. From the affirmatively furthering fair housing standpoint, we are planning for no affordable housing within our highest areas of opportunity. And we are planning for significant market rate housing in some of our lower income neighborhoods. And then in terms of the goals, policies, and programs, as Commissioner Nugent said, we're not tying those policies and programs to measurable outcomes of housing production, which I think is what HCD is looking for. At the end of the day, we're claiming that our housing production will almost triple from Cycle 5 to Cycle 6, from the 2,573 units we built in Cycle 5 to 7,015 units we've been allocated in Cycle 6, without making any changes to zoning as part of this housing element. And as we were discussing earlier, I think the part that I'm struggling with is that we're saying, well, we have the capacity within the current site inventory to meet that. And it doesn't make sense to rezone because many of those sites are already at the maximum 50 unit per acre density. But then why do we think the housing production will triple if we're not changing any of those things? And I do think the economic climate is different this year than it was 2 or 3 years ago. Interest rates are much higher. You know, I've seen in my professional work a significant decrease in construction. So I'm concerned that we're not going to spontaneously triple housing production. A lot of individuals and organizations have submitted public comments highlighting similar concerns. I really do hope we're all wrong. I hope I'm wrong. I hope the Housing Leadership Council is wrong, and the Campaign for Fair Housing Elements and Peninsula for Everyone and One San Mateo and Housing Choices and the Sierra Club and the Housing Action Coalition. Because I don't want our housing element to be deemed out of compliance by HCD. I don't want to lose additional control over our land use. I don't want us to be subject to the builder's remedy. I don't want us to lose out on funding, and I don't want to have to deal with additional litigation from organizations like Californians for Home Ownership, who have been targeting compliant cities with high development potential. So like Commissioner Nugent, we're on a very short timeline and I'm not really sure where to go from here. I don't know what actionable advice to offer for us to take in the next couple of weeks. So I think, you know, I will continue to hope for the best, but I think we should maybe start thinking about a plan B of what substantial changes we might begin to investigate and think about in the event that HCD comes back and says that the housing element is not in compliance. Those are all of my comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Seema, and thank you, Adam, for your typically extremely well thought out comments and suggestions. The commission is extremely strong because of your presence. I echo both of my fellow commissioners' concerns. I don't think any of us take this process lightly. I think we're only here because we love and want to serve this city at the highest possible way that we can. I think that's demonstrated on a very regular basis by us willing to question, to help, and to try and implement what we think is best for the people that we're representing, and that's every citizen in the city of San Mateo. The more I look at the housing element, and for that matter, the general plan, cities are tasked with almost insurmountable tasks. We are being asked to address centuries of racial segregation through housing and through implements, which will help the least advantaged of us, but in turn, it helps all of us. I think that my concerns have been, or I know my concerns have been consistent from day one. They've already been all mentioned, site inventory being somewhat inadequate, methodology for realistic capacity is questionable. The assembly of sites prior to having the AFFH filter in place, 0 sites in high opportunity locations, and locating sites in flood zones, areas of liquefaction and water intrusion. But the more I think about it, I feel that there were early decisions made and a plan and a track put in place, and we've locked ourselves in. And it's put us in an unenviable position with the state to negotiate. And I think it's handcuffed us and made us almost in an adverse situation with the state, not giving us avenues to negotiate and implement a plan that would get us to the point where we all say we want to go. I wrote a small follow-up note, and I wrote it because I wanted to make sure that I expressed myself in a manner that was inclusive, respectful, and in some way hopeful that we can get our documents to the point where they're not only certified by the state, but they mean something. They promote growth. They promote equality. They look at all of our beautiful general plan update goals and aspirations, and housing is key to them. And without it, we don't succeed. That's all there is to it. So here you go. The honor and excitement of being a planning commissioner during a housing element update is a humbling experience. To have input on such an important document that has generational, humanitarian, and environmental significance is a chance of a lifetime. Housing is the key to so many of life's necessities and the most effective way of reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. Putting together the best housing element was the unstated yet expected end game of this exercise. In San Mateo, unlike other cities in the Bay Area, we don't have a city council that is trying to fight our RENA allocation or is declaring our entire city a mountain lion habitat to stave off housing development. Unlike other cities, we don't have a planning commission that is trying to allocate new housing out of sight, literally underground. We may disagree on the details of where and what form, but our leadership and, most importantly, our community is united in the belief that we need more housing. Unlike other cities, we don't have a community that is satisfied with the current housing supply. In our 2022 statistically significant community survey, housing was cited as a top concern, with 2/3 of the respondents saying there is currently too little affordable housing for middle income and low income families. When asked about their zoning preferences, 63% of San Mateo residents indicated that they would support concentrating new housing in higher density buildings downtown and near transit up to 12 stories in height. There's also widespread support for affordable housing located in the highest opportunity neighborhoods. We had a once in an 8-year opportunity to make a meaningful change and address our housing crisis. We should have tried to be a leader in the Bay Area, setting an example for what it looks like to take the housing crisis seriously. We could have set a goal to achieve a pro-housing designation from HCD, which would have provided us additional state funding and benefits for affordable housing and infrastructure. We could have leveraged LA's approach to calculating realistic capacity and modeled each site's likelihood of development as a function of zoning, price, age, floor area ratio, and other predictors. We could have taken Campbell's approach to gathering substantial evidence, proactively contacting all the property owners on the draft site inventory, asking them their intent to develop over the next 8 years, eliminating sites where the owners had no intent to develop, and using data from cycle 5 to model the capacity of sites whose owners did not respond. Like Campbell, we could have proactively aimed to achieve 200% of our arena allocation. Like Alameda, the first ABAG city to be certified, we could have rezoned our entire city. Today's decisions on energy, transportation, housing production, and land use will all have direct and long-term effects on climate change because they lock in their respective emissions levels for decades, and cumulative emissions will push us over tipping points permanently and catastrophically. Failure to make hard choices now will rob our children and grandchildren of their rightful future. We cannot afford another ineffectual housing element for the next 8 years. It is unconscionable to conceive of losing yet another decade to business as usual. To meet any of our general plan goals, we must have a housing element that aggressively changes how and where we work, commute, recreate, and most importantly, how we house the most in need. I embraced the daunting task of assembling the housing element here in San Mateo with the expectation of producing the best document possible. Our first submittal was soundly rejected by the state for serious omissions. Many have viewed the response to the rejection letter as falling way too short of getting to the level of certification. We have the political will. We have a strong desire for more housing from the community. We have the resources, and we have a moral obligation to acknowledge and address our issues. The disconnect between what council, the planning commission, and most importantly, the public wanted and what was produced is maddening to me. Why did we not shoot for an A+? We aimed for a D-, and that is what we have. Why? Why didn't we capitalize on the will and the opportunity? The lost opportunities and thousands of hours squandered are both unacceptable. The will of the people has been ignored, and for that, there is no excuse. Bless you. So with that, are there any other further comments from the commission prior to going to the resolution?
To the chair.
Mhm.
I would like to see a better and more thorough response to some of the specific comments about policies in the HCD review letter. There was some change to our policies, but I just don't see them as meeting what was asked for. I also found that the matrix that was provided to the draft city council resolution is extremely hard to follow. It would take days to go through that and fully understand whether or not staff has sufficiently addressed each of the comments. And that's not a reasonable expectation, which is unfortunate. It's a huge document. And I feel like we are just running up against a wall when there's so much more to do. I'm just really bummed out. And the worst part about it is there's some really good nuggets in there that I'd like to see fleshed out. I think just procedurally, I don't see a world in which the city council, I don't know. I'm not gonna, I'm not gonna go there. I don't know what the city council is gonna do. I really don't. And I don't wanna, I should guess. Do we want to take a straw poll before we get too far into?
I did have two other issues that I would like to bring up prior to us going to the vote. Neither if the vote passes or not, I would still like to see, or I would like to see the timetable for, I believe it's H3 and H5 on the demolition requirement of a permit for substantial remodel would include a permit, and also to move the date up to 23-24 instead of 24-25 if for implementation. Normally, I'm sorry, throughout the discussion of that particular item, the necessity of getting a permit for a substantial remodel is key to implementing the program, and it is not it's not currently in the verbiage. And the other one that I was looking at, I'd like to support you also, Adam, on the implementation of some type of labor language, specifically on larger projects. I think it's a great idea. We've lost contact with labor because it's such a difficult conversation to have, but I definitely would want to support you in something like that also. Yes, Seema?
Through the chair, through the acting chair. I don't disagree with those two recommendations. I think what I'm struggling with is, I think we have to pick one or the other, in that we either ask for and create a list of recommended changes, or we don't. I'm nervous about us saying, here are 2 or 3 or 5 specific changes that we recommend, at the risk of ignoring,
No, I don't.
100 other changes
Sure.
that we think are necessary.
I don't have a problem with that. I just wanted to bring this to the two of you. So as part of a discussion, it will be decided by the city council either way.
Right.
Yes, you're absolutely right. I don't want to exclude other hundreds that we could include.
Right. Yeah, I intentionally did not prepare a list of recommended changes because I thought that would be quite onerous.
We might be here till 6 a.m.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, are we ready to take a vote or look at a motion?
Well,
I'm sorry.
No, I think
talking about a straw.
Yeah. I just, at this point, I would like to maybe ask staff, like, what procedurally does it matter to the city council whether or not, like, is there any legal reason for the city council to receive a recommendation or not a recommendation?
You need
from
to
the city
make a
council?
recommendation to the city council. You can recommend denial
Mhm.
if you do not feel comfortable recommending approval. That is totally within your purview.
Okay, okay. Thank you. That answered it perfectly.
So does anybody want to make a motion to forward this to the city council per the findings that we have?
I think, so I need to figure out the wording of it, right? But straw poll, what I'm gleaning from our discussions is that I believe all three of us agree that we do not think this current draft is in substantial compliance and will be declared compliant by HCD. So I would be interested in making a motion to somehow relay that opinion to the city council to say.
So, excuse me if I may interject. I have taken the liberty, if this is a no vote, does there need to be findings attached to that no vote? If so, I've prepared some.
It seems like you should have some findings to the opposite effect, in terms of helping to verbalize that.
That's how I have been directed in the past. If we were going to reach a no vote, you should have findings to substantiate that.
If you have something drafted, I think it would be helpful if you could read that into the record, and if we need to massage that, then we could help with that.
Okay, I've made it extremely simple. So do we need to first deny?
I think it would be helpful, well, we couldn't deny it without your motion.
So if we don't have a motion, it's moot.
You would make the motion and include what you want to find.
I'm sorry. What I'm saying is, do we first need to deny the submittal to council?
Maybe you can speak into.
Perhaps it would be helpful to work on off of the draft PC resolution where we can put in denial, but then substantiate with
Okay, so what I took was the three items which were used as the findings, which are on the staff report. And the first item, it says the 2023-2031 housing element as updated in the way it is drafted now says is internally consistent with the city's 2030 general plan. I have changed the word consistent into inconsistent. Would that suffice? And with the other two paragraphs also.
Through the chair, I don't have a good sense of whether or not that is true.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, I agree.
Okay.
I think your second bullet point that you're about to read, I do agree with.
Well, we don't have to,
Yeah.
they don't all have to be changed. Okay. The second one, it starts out with state law and 1, 2, 3, 4. The fifth line in there says with state law requirements, comma, does demonstrate that the city's 2023-2031 housing element contains each elements mandated by the state law. I replaced that does demonstrate with does not. Does that make sense? Does that hold water? Or do we have to draft a new document?
If you want to make that finding, you may want to make some references to support that position.
Okay, So the next one is the HCD review letter. Outstanding comments. The whole draft stayed as it is, and then I wrote on the bottom, we find that the feasibility of future housing sites, fair housing policy, housing goals, policies, and programs, and removing constraints to building housing have all failed to meet the state criteria for AFFH. Is that enough? Are those enough points to justify our denial?
I think that's ultimately up to the commission to decide.
Okay.
Is there a way that we can potentially, so simplify it? I think we should maybe try to simplify this. I think the point I'm garnering from the other commissioners, I don't want to speak for you, is that we feel that at this point, the housing element is not yet ready. It's not to the place where we think it will be in substantial compliance with state law and will be certified by HCD. And so that's basically all we're trying to say. What's the simplest way just to put that? Like,
I think that's all you need to say.
Okay.
I mean, that's what you guys
Okay.
have been discussing.
Perfect. Okay.
So what I just read, would that fulfill that requirement?
I think we can modify the resolution to say exactly what you guys want it to say. And I think that's what your discussion has reflected, that you don't think that the housing element as drafted is in compliance with state law.
Yeah.
But Zach says we need it because.
Well, I mean, we could potentially cite at a really high level, because I don't want to get into like the laundry list. We could say, due to concerns over the specific sites on the site inventory, the realistic capacity of those sites, and the goals, policies, and programs meeting requirements for affirmatively furthering fair housing.
And also, there are some comments within the HCD letter that are referring to other goals, policies, and actions that are not specific to AFFH. That
Eliminating constraints, development. Yeah.
All right. Sorry.
So let me just read that one last sentence one more time and see if it wraps up what your feelings are. We find that the feasibility of future housing sites, fair housing policy, housing goals, policies, and programs, and removing constraints to building housing have failed. Or do you want something like that, but different?
I think like that, but modify the end to say have failed to meet this, what you just said, failed to meet the state housing element law. Yeah. That failed to meet the state's requirements for housing elements.
State's requirements.
There's like a specific.
I think I said the statutory requirement.
Thank you. The statutory requirement, yes.
The state's statutory
requirement, yeah.
And please, staff, don't take this as a reflection of your work. You've done amazing.
State statutory requirements, period.
We can massage it a little bit. It
Yes,
doesn't need
thank you.
to be verbatim. I think
Perfect.
we understand what you're
Okay,
looking for.
I just want to make it simple.
Yeah.
Okay, so now do we move for a motion of denial?
It's a recommendation. You're
Yeah.
moving to recommend denial to the city council.
Yes.
And
Okay,
I think if I'm getting it right, you are making the motion and
I
someone
do
needs
not
to
need to
second
make
it.
a motion.
Someone needs to make the motion and
Yeah,
someone needs to.
I'd rather
second
not
it.
make it myself.
Yes.
Usually the chair does.
All right. I'm gonna make a motion to recommend denial of the adoption of the housing element. We find that the feasibility of future housing sites, fair housing policy, housing goals, policies, and programs, and removing constraints to building housing have failed to meet the state's statutory requirements.
I will second that motion.
All in favor? Say aye.
Can we do that, or do we need to roll call?
Yeah.
Oh, please. Oh, yeah, we can. Okay, roll call, please.
Chair Williams is absent. Vice Chair Netter,
Aye.
Commissioner Nugent,
Aye.
Commissioner Patel,
Aye.
and Commissioner Wiggins is absent.
Vote carries 3-0. Thank you.
New business.
New business. I just closed that item. On to new business.
It's a special meeting.
We don't have it.
I think our new business is adjournment.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, audience, for hanging in.
Thank you.